He was a doctor, an explorer, and a missionary. A man whose name became synonymous with courage, discovery, and unshakable faith. In the heart of the 19th century, while the world was changing rapidly, one man set out to chart the unknown, and in doing so, changed history. This is the story of David Livingstone. From the factories of Scotland to the vast landscapes of Africa, Livingstone's journey was not just one of miles and maps, but of purpose and perseverance. In this series, we're going to retrace his footsteps and explore the legacy he left behind, a legacy of compassion, of courage, and of Christ. So join us as we step into the life of a man who dared to go where few had gone before, and whose story still inspires us today. My own inclination would lead me to say as little as possible about myself, but several friends in whose judgment I have confidence have suggested that, as the reader likes to know something about the author, a short account of his origin and early life would lend additional interest to this book. Such is my excuse for the following egotism, and if an apology be necessary for giving a genealogy, I find it in the fact that it is not very long and contains only one incident, of which I have reason to be proud. To truly understand the man he became, we must first return to the beginning, his childhood in Scotland, the influence of his parents, and the formative experiences that shaped his early life. We will explore David Livingstone's early years through his own recollections, as well as through the accounts of those who lived closer to his time, people who wrote of the boy who would grow to become one of the most well-known missionaries the world has ever known. Author Sylvester Horne thus describes the time in which Livingstone was born. The year 1813, in which my story opens, was a momentous one in the history of Europe. The titanic struggle with Napoleon was nearing its crisis. Victor at Lutzen and Botzen, he had been defeated at Leipzig, on one of the bloodiest battlefields in modern war. Away in the Pyrenees, Wellington was grappling with Soule, and step by step driving him back onto French soil. Among those who were fighting in the ranks of the British Army were at least two men bearing the name of Livingstone. It is doubtful whether they even heard, amid the excitement and peril of the time, that away in peaceful Blantyre, and in their brother Neil's home, a lad had been born, and christened by the good, sound, scriptural name of David. Yet it may come to be believed some day that the birth of David Livingstone was of more vital influence upon the destiny of the world, even than the battle in which Napoleon's star set in blood 2 years later. For to open up a continent and lead the way in the Christianization of its countless millions was one of the most renowned victories of peace, a more difficult and notable achievement than to overthrow one form of military domination in Europe. The family of Livingstone came from the island of Ulva, off the coast of Argyllshire. Not much of interest is known about them, except that one of them died at Culloden, fighting for the Stuarts. This being the one incident of which Livingstone had reason to be proud of his family's name and history. David's father, Neil, settled in Blantyre as a dealer in tea. He had been previously apprenticed to a David Hunter, a tailor, and as many a good prentice has done before him, married his master's daughter. Neil Livingstone and his brave wife had a hard fight of it to make a living out of a small tea business and to educate and rear their children. 2 of the children died in infancy, but 3 sons and 2 daughters grew up in that humble home. David was the second son. David says of his father, "Though too conscientious ever to become rich as a small tea dealer, by his kindliness of manner and winning ways, he made the heartstrings of his children twine about him, as firmly as if he had possessed and could have bestowed upon them every worldly advantage. He reared his children in connection with the Kirk of Scotland, a religious establishment which had been an incalculable blessing to that country, but he afterwards left it, and during the last 20 years of his life held the office of deacon of an independent church in Hamilton, and deserved my lasting gratitude and homage for presenting me from infancy with a continuous, consistent, pious example, such as that of the ideal of which so beautifully and truthfully portrayed in Burns' Cotter's Saturday Night." But the returns from his business were so small that he found it necessary to send his children to work in the factory, even before they had finished their meager course of education at the parish school. The mother of David Livingstone was a woman of great charm and force of character, a delicate little woman with a wonderful flow of good spirits. In her, rare devotedness and sterling common sense were combined. She was the careful and thrifty housewife who had to make every sixpence go as far as possible, But she was remembered for her unfailing cheerfulness and serenity, and there was always something to be saved out of the meager income when the work of the Church of Christ needed extra support. Livingstone says of his mother that the earliest recollection of my mother recalls a picture so often seen among the Scottish poor, that of the anxious housewife striving to make ends meet. At the age of 10, I was put into the factory as a piecer to aid my earnings in lessening her anxiety. With a part of my first week's wages, I purchased rudiments of Latin and pursued the study of that language for many years afterwards, with unabated ardor, at an evening school, which met between the hours of 8 and 10. The dictionary part of my labors was followed up till 12 o'clock, or later, if my mother did not interfere by jumping up and snatching the books out of my hands. Livingstone had 4 siblings that survived infancy, his brothers John and Charles, and 2 sisters, Janet and Agnes, who were recorded as having never married. We will skim over them for now, but we'll touch on them and their relationship to David in a future work. So, as it has already been alluded to, at a very young age, David Livingstone went to work in a mill. Livingstone himself tells us that at the age of 10, he went to work as a piecer. He had to be at the mill at 6 in the morning, and his work lasted till 8 at night, with intervals for breakfast and dinner. Tired as he must have been, he went to an evening school, which met from 8 to 10. The schoolmaster was paid part of a salary by the company then owning the mills, and partly by fees, which were so moderate, Livingstone tells us, that all who wished for education could obtain it. He had learned to read in his own home, and he had also been so diligent a student at the Sunday school that his teacher gave him a New Testament for repeating the 119th Psalm, the whole of which feat he achieved with just 5 errors. At the time, he was only 9 years of age. Livingstone was a born naturalist, and despite his father's old-fashioned prejudices, he made himself a scientist at a very early age, searching old quarries for the shells and the limestone, scouring Clydeside for simples, and arranging the flora of the district in botanical order. These expeditions were often very prolonged and involved the endurance of fatigue and hunger, but the lad could not be discouraged. Unconsciously, he was bracing himself physically for the toils and tasks of after years. There's a fine story about the example he set for his native African escort, who on one occasion had been misguided enough to talk disrespectfully about his slim figure and shortness of stature. Thereupon Livingstone took them along for 2 or 3 days at the top of their speed, till they cried out for mercy. He had not scoured Clydeside for simples for nothing. His fearlessness is well illustrated in his daring and reckless exploit of climbing the ruins of Bothwell Castle, so that he might carve his name higher than any other boy had carved his. There, too, was the childlike ambition, which remained with him to the end, to do something which nobody else could surpass. No one, he wrote at the very end of his life on his last expedition, will cut me out after this exploration is accomplished. Then, he adds finally, and may the good Lord of all help me to show myself one of his stout-hearted servants, an honor to my children, and perhaps to my country and race. The story of Livingstone is the story of one of God's stout-hearted servants. Now, all of Livingstone's childhood and remarkable achievements of his adult life would hold little significance were it not for the greater purpose that guided him. Here, in his own words, we see his personal testimony of coming to faith. Great pains had been taken by my parents to instill the doctrines of Christianity into my mind, and I had no difficulty in understanding the theory of our free salvation by the atonement of our Savior. But it was only about this time that I really began to feel the necessity and value of a personal application of the provisions of that atonement to my own case. The change was like what might be supposed would take place were it possible to cure a case of color blindness. The perfect freeness with which the pardon of all of our guilt is offered in God's book drew forth feelings of affectionate love to Him who bought us with his blood, and a sense of deep obligation to him for his mercy has influenced, in some small measure, my conduct ever since. The days of David Livingstone's boyhood were great days for missions. The churches were everywhere awakened to their opportunity and responsibility, and you might say a new Act of the Apostles was being written. Letters from remote parts of the world, where the ancient battle between Christ and heathenism were being fought out anew, were eagerly read and deeply pondered. The romance and heroism of the majestic campaign captured and kindled both young and old. The year of Livingstone's birth was a year of singular triumph in the South Seas. It was the year when his great countryman, Robert Morrison, completed his translation of the New Testament into Chinese. When he was some 6 or 7 years old, another famous Scottish missionary, Robert Moffat, was settling on the Curraman, and Mrs. Moffat bore in her arms a baby girl, destined to become David Livingstone's wife. The life of Henry Martyn was a supreme call to consecration, while the stories of the heroes and heroines of the Moravian missions were almost as familiar in that humble Scottish home as the history of the Apostle Paul. This is only the beginning of Livingstone's story. In our next episode, we'll follow Livingstone into the next stage of his journey, his medical and theological studies, his call to missions, and the first steps that would carry him far from Scotland and deep into the heart of Africa. David Livingstone's journey to Africa didn't start when he boarded a ship. It started in the years before, with hard work, self-education, and a deep sense of calling. In this video, we'll look at the pivotal years of his life, from ages 19 to 27. We'll learn what events in his life prepared him for this groundbreaking work in Africa. From the age of 10 to 19, David Livingstone was a piecer in the cotton mills. He was then put at spinning, which was, he says, extremely severe on a slim, loose-jointed boy such as I was then. He was glad of the promotion, however, not only because of the higher wages, but on account of the opportunities it gave him for reading. Not that he had any more leisure than before. His working hours were still from 6 in the morning till 8 at night. But he found a way of fixing his book upon the spinning frame, where it would be constantly before his eyes as he passed and repassed at his work. In those days, machinery was not self-acting as it is now. David needed to give constant attention to his work, so that he never had so much as a whole minute at one time for his book. But by dwelling upon the few sentences which met his eye as he passed before his book, revolving them over and over in his mind until the next spare moment came, he really learned far more than if he could have gone more rapidly through his books. Thus, too, he gained a surprising power of abstracting his mind from outward objects, and even from the sense of personal discomfort. It was this power which made it possible for him in later years to carry on his writing and his scientific observation in the midst of the distracting noises of his native companions, and often when undergoing the most tormenting anxiety or the severest suffering. Far from regretting these early years of toil in the cotton mill or counting them as lost time, he felt that they were his best preparation for the work of his life. Although they kept him from entering on the work until he was nearly 30 years old, he often said that if he had to begin life again, he would have to begin it in the same lowly style and to pass through the same hardy training. Indeed, David Livingstone loved to trace the hand of Providence through his whole life, and to see how constantly it had been shaping events to fit him for a service of which he himself never dreamed. One of these providential guidings, which people often call coincidences, was the very promotion to cotton spinning, which, by giving him a better opportunity for reading, led by means of Dr. Dick's works to the opening of his eyes to the love of Jesus Christ, and to the fullness and freedom of the salvation which he offered. In the joyful gratitude which filled his soul as he realized his divine love, he longed to bring everyone else to the same glorious knowledge. It seemed to him that the salvation of men ought to be the chief desire and aim of every Christian, and with a full heart he resolved that he would give to the cause of missions all that he might earn beyond what was required for his subsistence. It did not occur to him at this time to give himself, but 2 years later there came, as he always believed, another providential leading which brought him to that decision. In the meantime, the books which had guided him to Christ had not led him away from his favorite studies. The works of Dr. Dick, being a reverential study of nature by the light of religion, had only whetted his appetite for scientific research, and the reading of these 2 years, carried on under the difficult conditions which we know of, was all the time molding his intellect into greater fitness for his as yet undreamed-of career. The providential call to that career came when he was 21 years old, in the shape of an appeal to the churches of Britain and America on behalf of China, by Mr. Gutzlaff, a missionary physician. The appeal made a profound impression on young Livingstone. The claims of so many millions of his fellow creatures, and the complaints of the scarcity of qualified missionaries, stirred him to give himself up to such work. From that time, his efforts were constantly directed toward that subject without any fluctuation. His first idea was to go to China, and to go, as Gutzlaff had said, as a missionary physician. His fondness for science made such a profession more attractive to him than that of a religious teacher merely, but his choice made the work of preparation far more formidable to a young man. A theological education could have been obtained at a very trifling expense, but a medical course was a costly affair. The question of expense, however, did not alarm him in the least. Telling no one of his plan but his parents and his minister, and receiving from them a hearty Godspeed, he set about making the earnings of 6 months pay not only the support of the year, but the cost of fees, books, and lodgings away from home for the other 6 months. No one could have done it but the boy who had learned by long experience of self-denial and cheerful endurance to meet all the discomforts of cold rooms, hard fare, and scanty clothing, not only with fortitude, but without any injury to his health. He was 23 years old when he began this arduous life. It was the winter of 1836-37. Furnished by a friend with a list of lodgings, Livingstone and his father set out from Blantyre one wintry day while the snow was on the ground and walked to Glasgow. The lodgings were all too expensive. All day they searched for a cheap apartment, and at last in Rotten Row they found a room at 2 shillings a week. Next evening David wrote to his friends that he had entered in the various classes and spent £12 in fees, that he felt very lonely after his father left, but would put a stout heart. Livingstone's spirits, always bright and buoyant, seemed to rise with the self-restraint of this hard winter's experience. He was more than ever the life of the household when, after his Saturday evening's long walk home, 7 miles of dreary trudging through snow and storm, he would spend hours in relating to the family all that had befallen him since the Monday morning. The home circle looked forward to these Saturday evenings as the brightest hours in the whole week. Livingstone's time while in Glasgow was devoted to the study of Greek, theology, and more especially of medicine. He made a few warm and influential friends, though at the time he gave no promise of any unusual capacity, and he was in far too humble a sphere to attract much attention. His chief friend was a Mr. Young, who was then assistant to one of the medical professors, and who afterwards became known as the man who discovered the means of refining petroleum and adapting it to illuminating purposes, and of manufacturing paraffin and paraffin oil. With Sir Paraffin, as Livingstone used to call his friend, he spent many pleasant hours busy with the turning lathe and other tools which were to be found in his room, and thus gaining knowledge and a dexterity which were of the very highest value to him, when, as he said, he had to become a jack of all trades in Africa. At the close of the first winter's study he returned to his mill work in Blantyre. When the second winter came, he found that his savings were not quite sufficient for his support, and for the first and only time in his arduous course was obliged to borrow. His brother John, barely richer than himself, became his creditor, with a generous confidence in his younger brother's ability, which proves the hard-working laborer to have been himself a man of no ordinary character. It was in the course of his second session in Glasgow that Livingstone decided to offer himself to the London Missionary Society. He preferred this society because it simply sent the gospel to the heathen, without reference to denomination. It was not, however, without a pang that he offered his services to any society, for it was not quite agreeable to one accustomed to work his own way to become in a measure dependent upon others. His offer was provisionally accepted, and Livingstone was summoned to London to meet the directors. On the night of his arrival he met a young Englishman who had come up for the same purpose, Joseph Moore, afterward missionary to Tahiti. Between these two sprang up a friendship so warm that their families used to speak of them as Jonathan and David. Mr. Moore, in writing of this time, says, "On Monday we passed our first examination. On Tuesday we went to Westminster Abbey." Who that had seen these two young men passing from monument to monument could have divined that one of them would one day be buried with the nations, rather, with the civilized world's lament in that sacred shrine? The wildest fancy could not have pictured that such an honor awaited David Livingstone. I grew daily more attached to him. I should be rather at a loss to reply. There was truly an indescribable charm about him, which with his rather ungainly ways, and by no means winning face, attracted almost everyone, and which helped him so much in his after wanderings in Africa. He won those who came near him by a kind of spell. After passing 2 examinations, we were both so far accepted by the society that we were sent to the Reverend Richard Cecil, who resided in Essex. Most missionary pupils were sent to him for a 3 months' probation, and if a favorable opinion was sent to the board of directors, they went to one of the independent colleges. The students did not for the most part live with Mr. Cecil, but took lodgings in the town, and went to his house for meals and instruction in classics and theology. Livingstone and I lived together. We read Latin and Greek, and began Hebrew together. Each day we took walks and visited all the spots of interest in the neighborhood, among them the county churchyard, which was the burial place of John Locke. Livingstone was at this time 25 years of age, a tall, awkward young man with a face only redeemed from utter plainness by his mother's beautiful blue eyes, but with that wonderful charm of which his friend speaks, which was the direct influence of a noble soul and an exalted Christian character. Among their duties, Mr. Cecil's pupils were expected to lead by turns at family prayer, and also to prepare sermons, which, having been corrected by their tutor, were learned by heart and delivered to congregations in the neighboring villages. One evening, Livingstone was sent for to supply the place of a minister who had fallen ill since morning. He took his text, writes his friend, read it out very deliberately, and then his sermon had fled. Midnight darkness came upon him, and he abruptly said, "Friends, I have forgotten all I have to say." And hurrying out of the pulpit, he left the chapel. The 3 months' probation being over, Mr. Cecil, judging from his hesitating manner of conducting family prayer, and from his lamentable failure in preaching, sent an unfavorable report to the mission board. Happily, one of the directors pleaded hard for another probation, and after another trial he was finally accepted, and sent to London for further study. Here he spent 2 years, chiefly in the study of medicine and in hospital practice. Not only was scientific study more congenial to him than abstract theology, but it was his best hope for gaining an entrance into China, his chosen field. Although he made many friends among his teachers, yet no one dreamed of his future success. His mind and character were both slow to mature, and the directors did not count him among their ablest men. They thought him unfit for cultured India, and China being then closed by the Opium War, it was proposed to send him to the West Indies. This Livingstone strongly opposed, since the years he had spent in medical study would be lost in a country where there was already regular practitioners. Finally, one of those providential leadings occurred, which he was so fond of tracing. The Reverend Dr. Moffat, whose name, as well as that of his whole family, will ever be identified with Africa, came to England, and created a great interest in his work. I had occasion, Dr. Moffat writes, to call for someone at Mrs. Sewell's, a boarding house for young missionaries where Livingstone lived. I soon observed that this young man was interested in my story, that he would sometimes come quietly and ask me a question or two, and that he was always desirous to know where I was to speak in public, and attended on those occasions. By and by he asked me whether I thought he would do for Africa. I said I believed he would, if he would not go to an old station, but would advance to unoccupied ground, specifically the vast plain to the north, where I had sometimes seen, in the morning sun, the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary had ever been. At last Livingstone said, "What is the use of my waiting for the close of this miserable war? I will go at once to Africa." The directors concurred, and Africa became his sphere. The decision and friendship with Dr. Moffat, who ever after exerted a strong influence over him, appeared to have been the needed touches to develop his latent powers. His whole character seemed to expand and his mind to blossom out into strength during the last few months in England. His preparations were by this time nearly complete. A serious illness for a time interrupted his plans, but gave him an opportunity to spend a few weeks in his beloved home. There was then nothing more to do but to pass his examinations, take his medical degree, and bid his family a last farewell. One precious evening he had to pass with them. He would have sat up all night to talk, but his mother would not hear of it. I remember my father and him, writes his sister, talking over the prospects of Christian missions. They agreed that the time would come when rich and great men would think it an honor to support whole stations of missionaries, instead of spending their money on hounds and horses. On the morning of 17th of November, we got up at 5 o'clock. My mother made coffee, David read the 121st and the 135th Psalm, and prayed. My father and he walked to Glasgow to catch the Liverpool steamer. There the father and son parted for the last time on earth. 3 days later, being then 27 years and 6 months old, Livingstone was ordained a missionary. It was the closing act of his old life, the beginning of his new. And from that day, he belonged to Africa. David Livingstone landed in Africa at Port Elizabeth on the west coast of Algoa Bay in April 1841. From the coast, he proceeded to Kerman, where he remained for 3 months, chiefly engaged in studying the language of the Bechuana people, among whom it was appointed that he should begin his labors as a missionary. With this object in view, he lived among the natives, isolating himself entirely from intercourse with his own countrymen. Thus begins Livingstone's life's work in Africa. Now, it would be impossible to cover the entirety of the work and exploration that Livingstone engaged in. But over the next few weeks, we hope to highlight his work and to encourage you to pick up some of the books about his life and work to read for yourself what he accomplished. Now, let's learn what life was like during Livingstone's first years in Africa. On leaving the ship at Angola Bay, he proceeded by land to Kuruman in the Botswana country, the most northerly station of the society in South Africa, and the usual residence of Mr. Moffat, who was still absent in England. In this, his first African journey, the germ of the future traveler was apparent. Crossing the Orange River, he says, I got my vehicle aground, and my oxen got out of order. Some of their heads where their tails should be, and others with their heads twisted round in the yoke, so far that they appeared bent on committing suicide or overturning the wagon. I like traveling very much. Writing to his parents from Port Elizabeth on the 19th of May, 1841, he gives his first impressions of Africa. He had been at a station called Hankey. The scenery was very fine. The white sand in some places near the beach drifted up in large wreaths, exactly like snow. One might imagine himself in Scotland, were there not a hot sun overhead. The woods present an aspect of strangeness, for everywhere the eye meets the foreign-looking tree from which the bitter aloe is extracted, popping up its head among the mimosa bushes and stunted acacias. Beautiful hummingbirds fly about in great numbers, sucking the nectar from the flowers, which are in great abundance and very beautiful. I was much pleased with my visit to Hankey. The state of the people presents so many features of interest that one may talk about it and convey some idea of what the gospel has done. The full extent of the benefit received can, however, be understood only by those who witness it in contrast with other places that have not been so highly favored. My expectations have been far exceeded. Everything I witnessed surpassed my hopes, and if this one station is fair a sample of the whole, the statements of the missionaries with regards to their success are far within the mark. The Hottentots of Hankey appear to be in a state similar to that of our forefathers in the days immediately preceding the times of the Covenanters. They have a prayer meeting every morning at 4 o'clock and well attended. They began it during a visitation of measles among them, and liked it so much that they still continue. He goes on to say that as the natives had no clocks or watches, mistakes sometimes occurred about ringing the bell for this meeting, and sometimes the people found themselves assembled at 12 or 1 o'clock instead of 4. The welcome to the missionaries, their own missionary was returning from the Cape with Livingstone, was wonderful. Muskets were fired at their approach, then big guns, and then men, women, and children rushed at the top of their speed to shake hands and welcome them. Now, it feels relevant at this point to go ahead and read a story of an account from Livingstone's own pen of an incident that happened which would cause long-term issues for the missionaries. This is a couple years into his time in Africa, but we're going to go ahead and do it here because I'm not sure quite where else to fit it in, and it's kind of relevant. And the story, from my understanding, took place in about 1843. 2 years into Livingstone's 32 years of missionary service, and it all revolves around a lion. So here is Livingstone's recounting. The villages of Mabatsa Mission Station, to which I removed in 1843, Kuruman, were troubled by lions, which leaped into the cattle pens by night and destroyed their cows. They even attacked the herds in open day. The people went once to attack the animals, but being rather cowardly compared with the Botswanas in general, they returned without slaying any. It is well known that if one troop of lions is killed, the remainder leave that part of the country. The next time, therefore, the herds were attacked, I went with the people to encourage them to rid themselves of the annoyance by destroying one of the marauders. We found the animals in a small hill covered with trees. The men formed round it in a circle, and gradually closed up as they advanced. Being below on the plain with a native schoolmaster named Mabawi, I saw one of the lions sitting on a piece of rock within the ring. Mabawi fired at him, and the ball hit the rock on which the animal was sitting. He bit at the spot struck, as a dog does at a stick or stone thrown at him, and then, leaping away, broke through the circle and escaped unhurt. If the Bakatla had acted according to the custom of the country, they would have speared him in his attempt to get away, but they were afraid to attack him. When the circle was reformed, we saw 2 other lions in it, but dared not fire lest we should shoot some of the people. The beast burst through the line, and as it was evident that the men could not be prevailed on to face their foes, we bent our footsteps towards the village. In going round the end of the hill, I saw a lion sitting on a piece of rock, about 30 yards off, with a little bush in front of him. I took a good aim at him through the bush and fired both barrels into it. The men called out, "He has shot! He has shot!" Others cried, "He has been shot by another man too, let us go to him." I saw the lion's tail erected in anger, and turning to the people I said, "Stop a little till I load again." When in the act of ramming down the bullets I heard a shout, and looking half round I saw the lion in the act of springing upon me. He caught me by the shoulder, and we both came to the ground together. Growling horribly, he shook me as a terrier does a rat. The shock produced a stupor similar to that which seems to be felt by a mouse after the first grip of the cat. It seemed a sort of dreaminess, in which there is no sense of pain or feeling of terror, though I was quite conscious of all that was happening. It was like what patients, particularly under the influence of chloroform, describe. They see the operation but do not feel the knife. This placidity is probably produced in all animals killed by the carnivore, and if so, is a merciful provision of the Creator for lessening the pain of death. As he had one paw in the back of my head, I turned round to relieve myself of the weight and saw his eyes directed to Mbawi, who was aiming at him from a distance of 10 to 15 yards. His gun, which was a flint one, misfired in both barrels. The animal immediately left me to attack him and bit his thigh. Another man, whose life I had saved after he had been tossed by a buffalo, attempted to spear the lion, upon which he turned from Mbawi and seized the fresh foe by the shoulder. At that moment the bullets the beast had received took effect, and he fell down dead. The whole was the work of a few minutes, and must have been the effect of dying rage. In order to take the charm from him, the Bakatla of the following day made a huge bonfire over the carcass, which was declared to be the largest ever seen. Besides crunching the bone into splinters, 11 of his teeth had penetrated the upper part of my arm. The bite of the lion resembled a gunshot wound. It is generally followed by a great deal of sloughing and discharge, and even afterwards pains are felt periodically in the part. I had on a tartan jacket, which I believed wiped off the virus from the teeth that pierced the flesh, for my two companions in the fray have both suffered from the usual pains, while I have escaped with only the inconvenience of a false joint in my limb. Now, it is interesting to note that this mauled limb was used to conclusively identify Livingstone when his body was returned to the UK from Africa 30 years later. So also in these opening years of David Livingstone's life in Africa, he found a wife. Let's learn about that. Till the year 1844, Livingstone had steadily repudiated all thoughts of marriage, thinking it better to be independent. Nor indeed had he met with anyone to induce him to change his mind. Writing in the end of 1843 to his friend Watt, he says, "There's no outlet for me when I begin to think of getting married, but that of sending home an advertisement to the evangelical magazine, and if I get very old, it must be for some decent sort of widow. In the meantime, I am too busy to think of anything of the kind." But soon after, the Moffats came back from England to Curman, and their eldest daughter, Mary, rapidly effected a revolution in Livingstone's idea of matrimony. They became engaged. In announcing his approaching marriage to the directors, he makes it plain that he had carefully considered the bearing which this step might have on his usefulness as a missionary. No doubt, if he had foreseen the very extraordinary work to which he was afterwards to be called, he might have come to a different conclusion. But now apparently he was fixed and settled. Mombasa would become a center from which native missionary agents would radiate over a large circumference, and his own life work would resemble Mr. Moffat's. For influencing the women and children of such a place, a Christian lady was indispensable, and who so liking to do it well as one born in Africa, the daughter of an eminent and honored missionary, herself familiar with missionary life and gifted with the winning manner and the ready helping hand that was so well adapted for this work. The case was as clear as possible, and Livingstone was very happy. In due time, the marriage was solemnized, and Livingstone brought his wife to Mombasa. Now, there is some confusion about whether he was married in 1844, 1845. He has it recorded in one of his books as 1844, but everything across the internet says 1845. I don't know which is accurate, but there's that fact. Now here in Mombasa, they began vigorously to work. Mrs. Livingstone with her infant school and her husband with all their varied agencies, medical, educational, and pastoral, which his active spirit could bring to bear upon the people. The people were a very superstitious race, and among other things, they had great faith in rain making. Livingstone had a famous encounter with one of their rainmakers, the effect of which was that the pretender was wholly nonplussed, but instead of being convinced of the absurdity of their belief, the people were rather disposed to think that the missionaries did not want them to get rain. Some of them were workers in iron who carried their superstitious notions into that department of life too, believing that the iron could be smelted only by the power of medicines, and that those who had not the proper medicine need not attempt the work. In the hope of breaking down these absurdities, Livingstone planned a course of popular lectures on the works of God in creation and providence to be carried out in the following way. I intended to commence with the goodness of God in giving iron ore, by giving, if I can, a general knowledge of the simplicity of the substance, and endeavoring to disabuse their minds of the idea which prevents them, in general, from reaping the benefit of that mineral which abounds in their country. I intend also to pay more particular attention to the children of the few believers we have with us as a class, for whom, as baptized ones, we are especially bound to care. May the Lord enable me to fulfill my resolutions. I have now the happy prospect before me of real missionary work. All that preceded has been preparatory. All this time, Livingstone had been cherishing his plans of a training seminary for native agents. He had written a paper and brought the matter before the missionaries, but without success. Some opposed the scheme fairly as being immature, while others insinuated that his object was to stand well with the directors and get himself made professor. This last objection so annoyed him that he withdrew his proposal. He knew that in his mode of prosecuting the matter he had not been very knowing. It would have been better to get some of the older brethren to accept it. He feared that his zeal had injured the cause he desired to benefit, and in writing to his friend Watt, he said that for months he felt a bitter grief, and could never think of the subject without a pang. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Livingstone's residence at Mombasa was embittered by a painful collision with the missionary who had taken part in rearing the station. But the noble spirit of Livingstone rose to the occasion. Rather than having any scandal before the people, he would give up his house and garden at Mombasa, with all the toil and money they had cost him, to go with his young bride to some other place, and begin anew the toil of house and school building, and gathering the people around him. His colleague was so struck with his generosity that he said, had he known his intention, he never would have spoken a word against him. Livingstone had spent all of his money, and now the salary of £100, it was not easy to build a house every other year. But he stuck to his resolution. Parting with his garden evidently cost him a pang, especially when he thought of the tasteless hands into which it was to fall. I like a garden, he wrote, but paradise will make amends for all our privations and sorrow here. Self-denial was a firmly established habit with him, and the passion of moving on was warm in his blood. Mombasa did not thrive after Livingstone left, but the brother with whom he had difference lived to manifest a very different spirit. Before he became one of the famous explorers of Africa, David Livingstone spent 10 years in the wilderness, not just crossing deserts and rivers, but facing failure, doubt, and discovery. So what did Livingstone really do between 1846 and 1856? Well, let's take a look. When we last left Livingstone, it was 1845. He was happily married to Mary Moffat Livingstone, and they had left the home he'd prepared for them in Mombasa due to a disagreement with a fellow missionary. The name of Livingstone's new station was Chanywe. It was situated some 40 miles from Mombasa, and in 1846 it became the center of Livingstone's operations among the Bakwans and their chief, Shishele. But Livingstone would not stay still over the next 10 years. In this time, he would travel extensively around the African continent, and this 10-year scope of travel will be the focus of this video. Now, before we get started, we want to share that this video may have less graphics, pictures, videos throughout due to the lengthy text we will be reading and the time constraint of trying to get it together. it'll have to be a little bit simpler this time around. I do apologize for that. And that serves as a reminder to you that the majority of the text for this video comes from books written by Livingstone himself or by those who lived during his time or actually knew him. So we will do our best to include a list of those books in the description so you can pick up a copy and read them yourself. And by using the links we have in the description, you are helping the channel, for which we are very grateful. But now on with the journeys of David Livingstone. The rumor of a great lake in the interior of southern Africa had long been current among the colonists. A rumor like this aroused the curiosity and stirred the enterprise of Livingstone. He resolved to discover what there was to be found beyond the terrible Kalahari Desert, which had hitherto proved the great obstacle to explorers. This desert, like Sahara of the South, was a region supposed to be absolutely without water, and it seemed hopeless to attempt to cross it with men and animals requisite to carry provisions. But the desert could be skirted, so the doctor determined to solve the question of the Great Southern Lake. Fortunately, there were two Englishmen, travelers and sportsmen, Murray and Oswell, who were delighted to join in such an expedition. They started from Calabang on June 1st, 1849. With wagons, bullocks, and a retinue of native servants and hunters. For 300 miles, the route lay through a dreary and sterile region, with scarcely any vegetation except occasional patches of cactus or wait-a-bit thorns and other plants that could subsist on the arid soil. Water could be rarely obtained, sometimes after days of interval, and the drought caused immense distress to the travelers and their cattle. After proceeding for a month in a northerly direction, they emerged from this arid region and on July 4th found themselves on the banks of a stately river, the Zoga, flowing to the east. A broad belt of reeds and rushes fringed the stream with trees and shrubs, above all which rose gigantic baobab trees, some of them 60 or 70 feet in circumference, with beautiful parasitic plants and creepers hung in festoons from the branches. Here and there the water ran in deeper channel through limestone rocks. The freshness of the vegetation and the beauty of the scenery recalled to the doctor his native Clyde, and he was cheered and gladdened by the prospect. Learning from the natives on its borders that the river flowed from a distant lake, the travelers ascended its course, and after journeying about 300 miles, following the windings of the stream, they joyfully beheld on August 1st the bright sunlit expanse of the often-rumored and long mysterious lake. The natives gave it various names, but that which most pleased the travelers was Ngami, the waters, and that was the name adopted by geographers. The lake was not found on examination to be as large as it was first anticipated, but it is a fine sheet of water all the same. It is about 70 miles in circuit, widest at the ends with less breadth in the middle. The Zogo, which is the chief outlet after a long course, is lost in an immense marsh or salt flat, a perfect forest of reeds, the haunt of vast herds of buffaloes, crocodiles, hippopotamus, and other amphibious animals abounded, and the surrounding country literally swarmed with every kind of game, from the ponderous elephants to the most graceful of the deer tribes. Since the way had been open to hunters and traders, and the sound of firearms been heard, the animals had rapidly decreased, and the sportsmen had to resort to wilder regions. But this does not lessen the interest with which we read of the discovery of Lake Ngami. It was the discovery which first made the name of Livingstone familiar to geographers and men of science, the Royal Geographical Society having awarded to him 1/2 of the royal premium for the year 1849 of the value of 25 guineas in the shape of a gold chronometer watch. Livingstone was very unwilling to retrace his steps, and would fain have continued his northward exploration, especially on learning that he was only about 10 days' journey from the Makalolo tribes, whose chief, Sibitoe, he had previously heard of as being anxious to be brought in communication with the white men. But at that time he had not the means of advancing, and the travelers returned to Kolobeng. Anxious to renew the attempt to reach Sibitoe and his Makolos, Livingstone started again from Kolobeng in April 1850. This time accompanied by Mrs. Livingstone and 3 children, and by Shishele and 20 of the Bakwanans. It was a long and weary journey to the lake, and then an outbreak of fever, with reports of the ravages of the tsetse fly, brought him to a standstill. An unexpected hindrance was added. The chief, where he had halted, was either jealous or afraid of the white men going to Sebetoye. It was only by parting with his own rifle, the gift of a friend, that the chief was appeased. Livingstone felt the importance of retaining his friendship, as he would have to leave his wife and children under his charge when he went forward. But when 2 of his children were laid down with fever, and the advance seemed impracticable, he returned once more to Colobang, where Mrs. Livingstone, soon after, gave birth to her 4th child, to live, however, for only a few weeks. It was the first death in our family, the doctor says in his journal, but was just as likely to have happened had we remained at home, and we now have one of our number in heaven. We now move ahead to 1852, and there is a report in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of a paper by Dr. Livingstone and Mr. Oswell on the greatest explorations in Central Africa beyond Lake Ngami. In this communication, the doctor gives some account of the country where he then was and of its ruler, with whose character he was much struck. The travelers remained for more than 2 months in his village on the river Chobe, and were most hospitably treated. Mr. Oswell stated that above 80 tribes paid him tribute, and that his influence extended over a circle of 800 to 1,000 miles. Dr. Livingstone writes about Sebetoye, the powerful chief who originally fled north after his tribe, the Mantatis, were repelled in 1824. Along the way, he fought through various tribal territories and eventually settled near the Chobe and Eshishiki rivers. When Sebetoye learned of Livingstone's attempt to explore his land, he eagerly tried to help. He sent men to find them, offered cattle to other chiefs to secure guides, and even traveled 300 miles south to be closer to Livingstone and the English traders. When we met, he seemed overjoyed, and having remarked that our cattle had been bitten by the tsetse fly and would certainly die, said, "Never mind, I have plenty and will give you as many as you need." He then appeared anxious to remove us to the northern or safe side of the Chobe River, and also to be near his town of Linyata. But when he saw that our wagons were too large for his canoes, he ordered the people of the town to remove to our resting place. A few days afterwards, however, and when the new village was quickly springing up, he became ill, and after lingering a fortnight, to our great regret, died. Such is the note about the chief in the narrative intended for publication. It is a calm, almost cold statement compared with the warmth of feeling expressed in his own journal, and we quote both because we have in them a more characteristic example of the contrast in what was meant for the public eye and the utterances of Livingstone's own heart. Although Livingstone had known Sebetoye for only a short time, he had the deepest regard for him. Here is Livingstone's writings on him. Dear Sebetoye, my heart bleeds for thee, and what would I not do for thee now? I will weep for thee to the day of my death. Little didst thou think when, in the visit of the white man, thou sawest the long-cherished desires of years accomplished, that the sentence of death had gone forth. Thou thoughtest that thou shouldst procure a weapon from the white man, which would be a shield from the attacks of the fierce Matabele. But a more deadly dart than theirs was aimed at thee, and though thou couldst well ward off a dart, none, ever better, thou didst not see that of the King of Terrors. I will weep for thee, my brother, and I would cast forth my sorrows and despair for thy condition. But I know that thou wilt receive no injustice where thou art gone. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? I leave thee to him. Alas, alas, Sebetoye, I might have said more to him. God forgive me from blood guiltiness. God forgive me from blood guiltiness. If I had said more of death, I might have been suspected as having foreseen the event, and as guilty of bewitching him. I might have recommended Jesus and his great atonement more. It is, however, very difficult to break through the thick crust of ignorance which envelops their minds. The chief had been present at the first Sunday service held by the missionary, and had listened with interest to his conversation. But Livingstone regretted that he had not spoken more to him. So tender was his conscience, and so deep his own sense of spiritual realities. In his book of missionary travels, no pages are more interesting than those referring to Sebetoye, and no incident into his intercourse with the natives of Africa gives more insight into the lofty character and generous heart of Livingstone. It was when residing at the village of Sebetoye on the Chobe that the travelers first heard of the great Zambezi River, and of the wonderful falls, which were visited on a later expedition. Traveling in a northwest direction after passing through Linyanta, they came on a fine river, called by the natives the Shisheke, afterwards found to be the Zambezi. We thank God for permitting us to see the glorious river. How magnificent! It was the first river I ever saw, says Livingstone. A series of rapids above the town of Shishake compels the boatmen to drag their canoes some distance along the shore, and about 80 miles below the same point a waterfall is reported, the spray and noise arising from which are so considerable as to have led to the name Moy a Tuenye, or smoke sounding. The spray is said to be visible 10 miles off. This was the first hint of the existence of the Victoria Falls of the Zambezi River, one of the discoveries with which Livingstone's name is associated. Now, the rumor of the falls is mentioned by him in a paper to the Geographical Society already referred to. His chief interest, now as ever in his explorations, was the prospect of opening up new fields for missions and seeking the welfare of the native people. Writing to the directors of the London Missionary Society, he says, "You will see by the accompanying sketch map what an immense region God in His grace has opened up. If we can enter in and form a settlement, we shall be able in the course of a very few years to put a stop to the slave trade in that quarter. And again, I am curious that though there is much impurity in my motives, they are, in the main, for the glory of Him to whom I have devoted myself. I never anticipated fame from the discovery of the Lake Ngami. I cared very little about it, but the sight of the rivers and countries beyond, all densely populated, awakened many and enthusiastic feelings. Consider the multitudes that, in the providence of God, have been brought to light in the country of Sabatoe. The probability that in our efforts to evangelize, we shall put a stop to the slave trade in a large region, and by means of the highway into the north which we have discovered, bring unknown nations into the sympathies of the Christian world." After this, his third journey, the intrepid missionary determined to send his wife and children home to England, partly for their safety and welfare, and partly that he might be able to devote himself more thoroughly to his plans for opening up Central Africa to commercial enterprise and Christian civilization. So it was on April 23, 1852, Mrs. Livingstone and her 4 children sailed from Cape Town. He was detained till June 8th, having much preparation to make for his next journey. He also took advantage of the delay to obtain instructions from the Astronomer Royal, Mr. afterwards Sir Thomas McClure, who was one of his best friends in future years. He did not arrive at Kerman till the end of August. It was then he heard of the murderous raid of the Boers on the Bakwins of Kolobeng, and the destruction by them of his own home and the mission station. It was a providential thing that he was not there at the time, but had gone on to the Cape with his family, for the Boers would have murdered him, so enraged were they at his befriending the natives. The books of a good library, my solace in our solitude, were torn to pieces and scattered about. My stock of medicines were smashed, and all our furniture and clothing carried off and sold by public auction to pay the expenses of the foray. In a letter to his wife, and in other forms, the doctor has given utterance to indignant expressions as to this wanton and barbarous outrage. So everything wasn't going smoothly for Livingstone. There were times of deaths of chiefs that he was hoping to reach, and then attacks by tribes of people who did not care that he was reaching other people, and so there's issues going on. But Livingstone doesn't let that stop him. And from here, he's going to attempt to travel from sea to sea to open up trade routes in Africa. So in 1850, Livingstone had proposed a bold plan to cross Africa from sea to sea, seeking healthier regions for mission work and a route to the coast. After failed attempts due to Boer hostility, he traveled alone with only native companions to Lintana in 1853, where local leader Sekatula warmly received him. Despite flooded terrain and difficult travel, the Makolo people helped him transport wagons across rivers, and thousands gathered to see the unfamiliar sights. Now, unable to find a suitable mission site, Livingstone aimed for the west coast, choosing the Portuguese town of Luanda. The 800-mile journey was perilous. Tribes were corrupted by the slave trade, food was scarce, and threats were constant. His faith helped him keep the group safe, and eventually a Portuguese trader helped him reach Kasango, and colonial authorities provided aid. In May 1854, they reached Luanda, where British consul Mr. Gabriel welcomed them. Livingstone was deeply moved to sleep in a bed after 6 months on the ground. His Makolo companions were astonished by the sights of civilization, and though offered passage home, Livingstone refused, unwilling to abandon his African friends to face the dangerous return journey alone, showing his loyalty and deep sense of duty. Luanda was left on September 20th, 1854, and the return trip to Lanyata covered new ground for Livingstone. He remained at Lanyata for a little time. He then prepared for his journey toward the eastern coast. It was November 3rd before a start was made. The doctor, being accompanied by Sekeletu and 200 men, were all fed at the chief's expense. They traveled till they came within sound and sight of the famed falls of the Zambezi, called by Livingstone Victoria Falls. Now today everyone is familiar by description and by picture of this magnificent wonder of the world. No account has been more graphic than that first published in the volume of Missionary Travels by Livingstone. Now the whole is too long to quote, but the following paragraph describes the approach to the smoke-sounding cataract. When about a half-mile from the falls, I left the canoe by which I had come thus far, and embarked in a lighter one, manned by the natives well acquainted with the rapids, who, availing themselves of the eddies and pools caused by the jutting rocks, brought me to an island in the middle of the river, and on the very edge of the lip over which the water rolls. In coming hither there was a danger of being swept down by the currents, which rushed along on each side of the island. But the river was now low, otherwise it would have been impossible to reach the spot. From the end of the island where we first landed, though it was within a few yards of the falls, yet no one could perceive where the vast body of water went. It seemed to lose itself in the earth, disappearing into a transverse fissure, only 80 feet wide. Creeping with awe to the extremity of the island, I peered down into a large rent which had been made from bank to bank of the broad Zambezi, and saw that a stream 1,000 yards broad leaped down 100 feet, and then became suddenly compressed into a space of 15 or 20 yards. The falls are simply caused by a crack made in a hard basalt rock from the right to the left bank of the Zambezi, and then prolonged from the left bank through 30 or 40 miles of hills. In looking down into the fissure on the right of the island, nothing is visible but a dense white cloud, which at the time we visited the spot had 2 bright rainbows on it. From this cloud a great jet of vapor, exactly like steam, mounted up to the height of 200 or 300 feet, and then condescending, changed its hue to that of dark smoke, and came back in a constant shower, which soon wetted us to the skin. Subsequent explorations have added much to our ideas of the grandeur of the scene, both as to the vastness of the volume of water and the depth of the descent. We still read with intense interest Livingstone's account of his first impressions on discovering Victoria Falls. Soon after rejoining the navigable part of the river, the explorer was rewarded for all his toils and sufferings. He discovered a highland region, free from tangled woods and pestilential marshes, with a fertile soil carpeted with short grass, stretching away to the eastward from the confluence of the Kafu with the Zambezi. Filled with thankfulness at having at last found a suitable site for mission station, he pursued his eastward course. Though food was plenty and game abundant, David Livingstone's journey grew more difficult after reaching Zumbo, where he first saw signs of Europeans. As he traveled east, hostile encounters with natives increased, his oxen died from tsetse flies, canoes were unavailable, and travel became increasingly harsh. He struggled on foot to a place where Portuguese officials welcomed him, but he was still 300 miles from the coast, and he didn't reach Quilomane until May 26. There, the British government, having tracked his journey, sent HMS Start to receive him. Later, HMS Frolic brought him to Mauritius, where he arrived August 12th. From there he sailed for England in November, and landed at Dover on December 9, 1856, the first time he had set foot on British soil in almost 15 years. A day or two later he met Mrs. Livingstone at Southampton, where she had expected he would land. Your explorations have created immense interest, and especially in England. And that man must be made of bend leather who can remain unmoved at the rehearsal even of a tithe of your daring enterprises. The honors awaiting you at home would be enough to make a score of light heads dizzy, but I have no fear of their affecting your upper story, beyond showing that your labors to lay open the recesses of the vast interior have been appreciated. You have succeeded beyond the most sanguine expectations in laying open a world of immoral beings, all needing the gospel, at a time, now that war is over, when people may exert their energies on an object compared with which that which has occupied the master minds of Europe and expended so much money and shed so much blood is but a phantom. These were the words of Robert Moffat to his son-in-law David Livingstone upon his return to England. Now, in this video, we will take a look at the life of David Livingstone as he returns to England for the first time after being the first European to see the newly christened Victoria Falls. We will try to share some of the insights as to what he experienced having left the country as a no-name doctor and missionary, only to return a national hero for his work of missions and exploration. As we have said before, the majority of the text for these videos is taken from books recounting his life and explorations. If you'd like to read the entirety of those books for yourselves, you can find them in the description below or by clicking the QR code on the screen. And by using our link to Amazon, you are helping the channel to grow so we continue to make videos about God's peculiar people. We greatly appreciate your help with that. But for now, let's turn our minds to learning more about David Livingstone's hero's welcome. Now, Livingstone had reached England in December 1856 and was met by his wife after a separation of more than 5 years. He had been 15 years absent from England and during that time had traveled over more than 11,000 miles of African ground. The joy of homecoming was not without its clouds, though. Tidings of his father's death had reached him at Cairo, and the blow to his bright anticipations was a heavy one. Livingstone had too often faced death to feel the separation a wide one. His father was nearer to him dead than he had been living for many a year, but he sorely missed the loving sympathy on which his lonely wanderings he had often counted as one of his earthly rewards. On the 15th of December, the Royal Geographical Society held a special meeting to welcome him. Sir Roderick was the chair. The attendance was numerous and distinguished and included some of Livingstone's previous fellow travelers, Colonel Steele, Captain Vardon, and of course Mr. Oswell. Here he was awarded the Victorian or Patron's Medal for his journey from the Cape to Linyata and Luanda, and for the further feature of journeying from the Atlantic Ocean at Luanda to the Indian Ocean at Quillimane. On receiving the medal, Livingstone apologized for his rustiness in the use of his native tongue, said that he had only done his duty as a Christian missionary in opening up a part of Africa to the sympathy of Christendom, that Steele, Vardon, or Oswell might have done all that he had done, that as yet he was only buckling on his armor and therefore in no condition to speak boastfully, and that the enterprise would never be complete till the slave trade was abolished and the whole country opened up to commerce and Christianity. On the next day, December 16th, Mr. Livingstone had his reception from the London Missionary Society in Freemasons Hall. Lord Shaftesbury was in the chair. "What better thing can we do," asked the noble Earl, "than to welcome such a man to the shores of our country? What better than to receive him with thanksgiving and rejoicing that he is spared to refresh us with his experience and give his strength to further exertions? What season more appropriate than this, when at every hearth and in every congregation of worshippers the name of Christ will be honored with more than ordinary devotion, to receive a man whose life and labors have been in humble, hearty, and willing obedience to the angel song. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." In reply, Livingstone simply acknowledged the kindness of the directors, with whom for 16 years he had never had a word of difference. Now, as soon as he could tear himself away from these first engagements, he ran down to Hamilton to see his mother, children, and other relatives. His father's empty chair deeply affected him. The first evening, writes one of his sisters, he asked all about his illness and death. One of us remarking that after he knew he was dying, his spirits seemed to rise, David burst into tears. At family worship that evening, he said with deep feeling, "We bless thee, O Lord, for our parents. We give thanks for the dead who has died in the Lord." At first, Livingstone thought that his stay in the country would only be for 3 or 4 months, as he was eager to be at Quillimane before the unhealthy season set in, but he was induced to remain longer. Why? One of the main reasons was for the writing of a book of his travels, the book we know today as Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. Now, just as a note, that is simply the simple version of the name of the book. Many times it's just called Livingstone's Missionary Travels. But let me read you the entirety of the name for this book. Let me see if I can get this all out. So it is Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. Includes a sketch of 16 years residence in the interior of Africa and a journey from the Cape of Good Hope to Luanda on the west coast, thence across the continent, down the river Zambezi to the Eastern Ocean. So thankfully we don't have to read all of that name every single time, but often it's just mentioned, referenced as Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. Now, if Livingstone ever doubted the propriety of writing the book, the doubt must have vanished, not only in view unequaled interest excited by the subject, but also of the readiness of unprincipled adventurers, and even some respectable publishers, to circulate narratives often mythical and quite unauthorized. The early part of the year 1857 was mainly occupied with the labor of writing. For this he had materials in the journals which he had kept so carefully, but the business of selection and supplementing was laborious, and the task of arrangement and transcription very irksome. In fact, this task tried the patience of Livingstone more than any which he had yet undertaken, and he used to say that he would rather cross Africa than write another book. His experience of bookmaking, though, increased his respect for authors and authoresses 100-fold. Now, in spite of his literary work, the stream of public honors and public engagements began to flow very strongly. The Prince Consort granted him an interview soon after his arrival, in presence of some of the younger members of the royal family. In March 1857, it was agreed to present him with the Freedom of the City of London in a box of the value of 50 guineas, and in May the presentation took place. Most of his public honors, however, were reserved till autumn. The Missionary Travels was published in November 1857, and the success of the book was quite remarkable. It has sometimes been a complaint that so much of the book is occupied with matters of science, geographical inquiries, descriptions of plants and animals, accounts of rivers and mountains, and so little with what directly concerns the work of the missionary. In reply to this, it may be stated in the first place that if the information given and the views expressed on missionary topics were all put together, they would constitute no insignificant contribution to missionary literature. But there was another consideration. Livingstone regarded himself as but a pioneer in missionary enterprise. During 16 years he had done much to bring the knowledge of Christ to tribes that had never heard of him. Probably no missionary in Africa had ever preached to so many Africans. In some instances, he had been successful in the highest sense. He had been the instrument of turning men from darkness to light, but he did not think it right to dwell on these cases because the converts were often inconsistent and did not exemplify a high moral tone. In most cases, however, he had been a sower of seed and not a reaper of harvest. He had no triumphs to record, like those which had gladdened the hearts of some of his missionary brethren in the South Sea Islands. He wished his book to be a record of fact, not a mere register of hopes. The missionary work was yet to be done. It belonged to the future, not to the past. By showing what vast fields there were in Africa ripe for the harvest, he sought to stimulate Christian enterprise of the church and lead them to take possession of Africa for Christ. He would diligently record facts which he had ascertained about Africa, facts that he saw had some bearing on its future welfare, but whose full significance in that connection no one might yet be able to perceive. In a sense, the book was a work of faith. He wished to interest men of science, men of commerce, men of philanthropy, ministers of the crown, men of all sorts in the welfare of Africa, where he had so varied a constituency to deal with, and where the precise method by which Africa would be civilized was yet so indefinite. He would faithfully record what he had come to know, and let others build as they might with his materials. Certainly in all that Livingstone has written, he has left us in no doubt as to the consummation to which he ever looked. His whole writings and his whole life are a commentary on his own words. The end of the geographical feat is only the beginning of the enterprise. Through the great success of the volume and the handsome conduct of the publisher, the book went on to yield him a small fortune. Now, finding himself in the autumn free of the toil of bookmaking, Dr. Livingstone moved more freely through the country, attending meetings and giving addresses. In August, he went to Dublin to the meeting of the British Association for Advancement of Science and gave an interesting lecture there. In September, we find him in Manchester, where the Chamber of Commerce gave him a hearty welcome and entered cordially into his schemes for the commercial development of Africa. In the course of the same month, his foot was again on his native soil, and there his reception was remarkably cordial. In Glasgow, the university, the corporation, the faculty of physicians and surgeons, the United Presbyterians, and the Associated Operative Cotton Spinners of Scotland came forward, all to pay him honour. Livingstone would go on to visit and speak in Edinburgh, Oxford, Cambridge, and many other places. Perhaps one of his most interesting interviews came on February 13, 1858, when he had the honour of an interview with Her Majesty, the Queen. A Scottish correspondent of an American journal, whose letter at other points showed that he had good information, after referring to the fact that Livingstone was not presented in the usual way, says, "He was honoured by the Queen with a private interview. She sent for Livingstone, who attended Her Majesty at the palace without ceremony, in his black coat and blue trousers, and his cap surrounded with a stripe of gold lace. This was his usual attire, and the cap had now become the appropriate distinction of one of Her Majesty's consuls, an official position to which the traveller attaches great importance, as giving him the consequence in the eyes of the natives and authority over the members of the expedition. The Queen conversed with him affably for half an hour on the subject of his travels. Dr. Livingstone told Her Majesty that he would now be able to say to the natives that he had seen his chief, his not having done so before having been a constant subject of surprise to the children of the African wilderness. He mentioned to Her Majesty also that the people were in the habit of inquiring whether his chief was wealthy, and that when he assured them she was very wealthy, they would ask how many cows she had got, a question at which the Queen laughed heartily. In the only notice of the interview to which we have found in Livingstone's own writings, he simply says that Her Majesty assured him of her good wishes in his journeys. It was the only interview with his sovereign he ever had. When he returned in 1864, he said that he would have been pleased to have another, but only if it came naturally and without his seeking it. The Queen manifested the greatest interest in him and showed great kindness to his family when the rumors came of his death. Finally, on the 10th of March, 1858, Dr. Livingstone, accompanied by Mrs. Livingstone, their youngest son Oswell, and the members of his expedition, sailed from Liverpool to board Her Majesty's colonial steamer, the Pearl, which carried sections of a boat called Ma Robert, the steam launch with Mrs. Livingstone's African name, which was to be permanently used in the exploration of the Zambezi and its tributaries. When we think of the great missionary explorer David Livingstone, images of vast African landscapes, dangerous treks, and dramatic encounters come to mind. But often overlooked in his story is a woman who walked many of those same dusty trails, who faced disease, danger, and discouragement right alongside him, or sometimes alone. Her name was Mary Moffat Livingstone, and she was not just David Livingstone's wife. She was a missionary's daughter, a pioneer in her own right, and a woman whose life was marked by both courage and heartbreaking sorrow. As we begin this look at Mary Livingstone, I want to remind you all that the images might be limited in this video, as there's not really a lot of images of Mary Livingstone. I believe there's really only one out there. I've been able to create an AI-generated image that kind of shows her and Livingstone together, but there's really not much there. And of course, the other disclaimer is that most of this text is taken from books about David Livingstone, and we'll have those linked in the description down below. But now, let's learn more about Mary Moffat Livingstone. Mary was born in South Africa in 1821, the first child of Robert and Mary Moffat, legendary missionaries with the London Missionary Society. She was raised in the rugged interior of southern Africa, far from the comforts of European society. While other British girls learned to sew or dance, Mary learned to speak Setswana, helped with mission work, and traveled the region with her parents. Her home was the Kuruman Mission Station, called the Fountain of Christianity in Africa, and it was here that she first developed a deep love for the people of southern Africa, a love that would define her life's path. Louise Houghton, in her book on Livingstone, gives this description of Mary Moffat Livingstone. She says, "She was a charming girl, full of life, vivacity, courage, and endurance. The daughter of a missionary, familiar with the duties which would devolve upon a missionary's wife, speaking the native languages and understanding the native character. Mary Moffat was especially fitted to be a helper to Livingstone in the work which he had planned, and to influence the native women and children by setting them an example of Christian living." In 1841, a young Scottish missionary named David Livingstone arrived at Kerman to begin his own work in Africa, and met Mary on her return from England in 1843. Livingstone recounts in Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa how he asked Robert Moffat for permission to marry his daughter. For after nearly 4 years of African life as a bachelor, Mr. Moffat having returned from a visit to England in 1843, I screwed up courage to put a question beneath one of the fruit trees, which I believe is generally accompanied by a peculiar thrilling sensation in the bosom, and which those who have never felt it can no more explain than the blind man did who thought that scarlet color was like the sound of a trumpet, and I became united in marriage to his eldest daughter Mary in 1844. Now, following their union, the young couple engaged most vigorously in their chosen duties at Mbatsa, preaching, studying, teaching school, household labor, translating hymns, practicing medicine, and training native helpers. But theirs was no ordinary missionary marriage. The newlyweds would spend their early years together, not just managing mission stations, but exploring the interior, often traveling by ox cart or foot across unforgiving terrain and enduring years of separation. Now, Mary joined with David on many of his expeditions, even while pregnant or nursing infants. She would give birth to 6 children, though the family was frequently separated due to illness and because of the dangers of travel. The names of their children are Robert, Agnes, Thomas, Elizabeth, who died as an infant, William Oswell, and Anna Mary. Now, life was far from easy. Mary suffered intense homesickness, bouts of malaria, and the stress of constant movement. And we will share part of one story from Mary Livingstone's travels with her husband to kind of give you an idea of what journeying in Africa at this time, and with Livingstone, with the explorer mindset, what life was like. So let's begin with that. This is taken from the book David Livingstone, The One Who Followed Christ. As Mrs. Livingstone's health continued delicate, the family went to Kerman for a visit to her early home, but were ready for a third attempt to reach Sebetoye's country in the following year. Despite all the dangers from thirst, fever, and mosquitoes, Mrs. Livingstone was not to be deterred from accompanying her husband, though the objections of friends were painfully urgent. It was their intention to make this a final journey, at least for some years, the plan being to find a healthy spot somewhere in the hilly country, which was known to exist to the north of the lake, and make it the center of a new series of mission operations. They had a guide named Shobo who lost his way. The oxen were terribly fatigued and thirsty, and on the morning of the 4th day of their travels, Shobo, after professing ignorance of everything, vanished altogether. So it says that we went in the direction in which we last saw him, and about 11 o'clock we began to see birds, then the trail of a rhinoceros, and at this we unyoked the oxen, and they, apparently knowing the sign, rushed along to find the water in the river Mehabi. The supply of water in the wagons had been wasted by one of the servants, and by the afternoon only a small portion remained for the children. This was a bitterly anxious night, and the next morning the less there was of water, the more thirsty the little rogues became. The idea of their perishing before our eyes was terrible. Not one syllable of upbraiding was uttered by their mother, though the tearful eye told the agony within. In the afternoon of the 5th day, to our inexpressible relief, some of the men returned with a supply of that fluid of which we had never before felt the true value. The mosquitoes were terrible, their sting causing extraordinary pain, and the children were so covered with bites that not a square inch of whole skin was to be found on their body. Passing to the east of the Lake Ngami, the travelers met some of the Mokolo, Sebetoye's people, on the rivers of the Chobe, nearly 200 miles north of the lake. From them, they learned that Sebetoye was only 20 miles further on, having come more than 100 miles to meet and welcome the white men. He was upon an island with all of his principal men around him, and engaged in singing when we arrived. We have informed him of the difficulties we had encountered, and how glad we were that they were all at an end by at last reaching his presence. He signified his own joy, and added, "Your cattle are all bitten by the tsetse, and will certainly die. But never mind, I have cattle, and will give you as many as you need." Now, this region that Sebetoye's tribe was in, the country being between the Chobe and the Zambezi was very low, swampy, and often flooded, so no place could be found sufficiently healthy for a settlement, especially in those districts, because it was unsafe from being exposed to the incursion of other tribes in the country who were not maybe the biggest fans of the Makolo. So there was nothing to do but carry the family all back to Kolobeng. And on the way southward, another child was born, a son, whom they called William Oswell. A few days later, the child next older, Thomas, was attacked with fever, but finally recovered. And then, to complete their trials, when at last they reached Kolobeng, they found the station deserted. Drought and the Boers had made it no longer a safe habitation, and the people had forsaken it. Now, it felt that the whole plan of Livingstone's life work must be given up, or that some safe refuge must be found for his wife and children during the next few years. And all things considered, it seemed wisest to send them to England, but this was a severe trial. Nothing, he writes to the directors, but a strong conviction that this step will lead to the glory of God would make me orphanize my children. Even now, my bowels yearn over them. They will forget me. But I hope when the day of trials come, I shall not be found a more sorry soldier than those who serve an earthly sovereign. So the long journey to Cape Town was made, with a short halt at Kerman for a farewell visit. Mr. Oswell generously fitted up Mrs. Livingstone and the children with the money drawn from the preserves on her own estate, as he called the proceedings of his elephant hunting. On the 23rd of April, 1852, the parting which they supposed to be but for 2 years, but which proved to be 5, took place. Mrs. Livingstone and the 4 children sailed for England. So you get a sense of what it was like. The travels, the hardships, the desertion by people who are supposed to be helping guide you. There's so much that was happening, and tough to do this with children. So Livingstone had to make the very difficult decision to send his wife and family back to England. I don't know why it wasn't the decision to just have them stay in Kerman with the Moffats. There's probably more we could read about that. I haven't had time. But the decision was made, ultimately it was better to go back to England. But after this 5 years of separation, Livingstone did return. So the years that had elapsed since David Livingstone bade his wife farewell at Cape Town had been to her years of deep and often terrible anxiety. Letters were often lost, and none seem more frequently to have gone missing than those between him and her. A stranger in England without a home, broken in health, with a family of 4 to care for, often without tidings of her husband for great stretches of time, and harassed with anxieties and apprehensions that sometimes proved too much for her faith, the strain on her was very great. Those who knew her in Africa when she was queen of the wagon and full of life, she directed the arrangements and sustained the spirits of a whole party, could hardly have thought her the same person in England. When Livingstone had been longest unheard of, her heart sank altogether, but through prayer, tranquillity of mind returned, even before the arrival of any letter announcing his safety. She had been waiting for him at Southampton, but he ended up arriving at Dover. But as soon as possible, he was with her, reading the poetical welcome which she had prepared, in the hope that they would never part again. 100,000 welcomes, and it's time for you to come, from the far land of the foreigner to your country and your home. Oh, long as we were parted, ever since you went away, I have never passed a dreamless night or knew an easy day. Do you think I would reproach you with the sorrows that I bore? Since the sorrow is all over, now I have you here once more. And there's nothing but the gladness and the love within my heart, and the hope so sweet and certain that again we'll never part. 100,000 welcomes, I know my heart is gushing o'er, with love and joy and wonder, thus to see your face once more. How did I live without you these long, long years of woe? It seems as if 'twould kill me to be parted from you now. You'll never part me, darling, there's a promise in your eye. I may tend you while I'm living, you will watch me when I die. And if death but kindly lead me to that blessed home on high, what 100,000 welcomes will await you in the sky. Having for once lifted the domestic veil, we cannot resist the temptation to look into another corner of the home life. Among the letters of congratulations that poured in at the time of Livingstone's return to England, none was more sincere or touching than that which Mrs. Livingstone received from her mother, Mrs. Moffat. In the fullness of her congratulations, she does not forget the dark shadow that falls on the missionary's wife when the time comes for her to go back with her husband to their foreign home, and requires her to part from her children. Tears and smiles mingle in Mrs. Moffat's letter, as she reminds her daughter that they that rejoice need to be as though they rejoice not. My dearest Mary, in proportion to the anxiety I have experienced about you and your dear husband for some years past, so now is my joy and satisfaction, even though we have not yet heard the glad tidings of your having really met, but this for the present we take for granted. Having from the first been in a subdued and chastened state of mind on the subject, I endeavour still to be moderate in my joy. With regard to you, both oftentimes has the sentence of death been passed in my mind, and at such seasons I dared not, desired not, to rebel, submissively leaving all in the divine disposal. But now I feel that this has been a suitable preparation for what is before me, having to contemplate a complete separation from you to that day when we meet with the spirits of just men, made perfect in the kingdom of our Father. Yes, I do feel solemn at death, but there is no melancholy about it, for what is our life, so short and so transient? And seeing it is so, we should be happy to do, or to suffer, as much as we can for him who bought us with his blood. Should you go to those wilds which God has enabled your husband, through numerous dangers and deaths, to penetrate, there to spend the remainder of your life, and as a consequence, there to suffer manifold privations, in addition to those trials through which you have already passed, and they have not been few, for you had a hard life in this interior, you will not think all too much when you stand with that multitude, who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. Already is my imagination busy picturing the various scenes through which you must pass, from the first transport of joy on meeting, to that painfully anxious hour when you must bid adieu to your darlings, with faint hopes of ever seeing them again in this life. And then, what you may both have to pass through in those inhospitable regions. From what I saw in Mr. Livingstone's letter to Robert, I was shocked to think that that poor head, in the prime of manhood, was so like my own, who am literally worn out. The symptoms he described are so like my own. Now, with a little rest and relaxation, having youth on his side, he must regain all. But I cannot help fearing for him if he dashes at once into hardships again. He is certainly the wonder of his age, and with a little prudence as regards to his health, the stores of information he now possesses might be turned to a mighty account for poor Africa. We do not yet see how Mr. L. will get on. The case seems so complex. I feel, as I have often done, as regarding ourselves, it is a subject more for prayer than for deliberation, separated as we are by such distances, and such a tardy and eccentric post. I used to imagine that when he was once got out safely from this dark continent, we should only have to praise God for all of his mercies to him and to us all, and for what he had effected by him. But now I see we must go on seeking the guidance and direction of his providential hand, and sustaining and preventing mercy. We cannot cease to remember you daily, and thus our sympathy be kept alive with you. After 2 years spent back home in England, the last days were spent in arrangements for the future expedition, settling family plans and bidding farewell. Mrs. Livingstone accompanied her husband, along with Oswell, the youngest child at the time, on the 10th of March, 1858, on board Her Majesty's colonial steamer, the Pearl, for their return to Africa. Sierra Leone was reached within a fortnight, and on leaving Sierra Leone, the weather became very rough, and from the state of Mrs. Livingstone's health, inclining very much to fever, it was deemed necessary that she, with Oswell, should be left at the Cape, go to Kerman for a time, and after her coming confinement, join her husband on the Zambesi in 1860. This, says Livingstone in his journal, is a great trial for me, for had she come with us, she might have proved of essential service to the expedition in case of sickness or otherwise, but it may all turn out for the best. In 1862, Mary was finally able to rejoin David in Mozambique, hoping to support him in his Zambesi expedition, but her health had become weakened by years of hardship. Mary's desire to be with her husband was intense. Not only the longings of an affectionate heart and the necessity of taking counsel with him about the family, but the feeling that when overshadowed by one whose faith was so strong, her fluttering heart would regain its steady tone, and she would be better able to both help him and the children, gave vehemence to this desire. Her letters to her husband tell of much spiritual darkness. His replies were the very soul of tenderness and Christian earnestness. Providence seemed to favor her wish, and the vessel in which she sailed was preserved from imminent destruction, and that she had the great happiness of finding her husband alive and well. But on the 21st of April, Mrs. Livingstone became ill once again. On the 25th, the symptoms were alarming. On the 26th, she was worse and delirious. And on April 27th, 1862, Mary Moffat Livingstone died at the age of 41 in Chupanga, Mozambique. She was buried beneath a tree near the Zambesi River. David, broken by grief, carved a cross into the tree himself and described her as a true helpmeet, and much more than most missionary wives. A few extracts from Livingstone's journal will further show the state of his heart. "It is the first heavy stroke I have suffered, and quite takes away my strength. I wept over her who well deserved my tears. I loved her when I married her, and the longer I lived with her, I loved her the more. God pity the poor children, who were all tenderly attached to her, and I am left alone in the world by one whom I felt to be a part of myself. I hope it may, by divine grace, lead me to realize heaven as my home, and that she has just preceded me in the journey. Oh, my Mary, how often we have longed for a quiet home, since you and I were cast adrift at Kolobeng. Surely the removal by a kind Father who kneweth our frame means that he rewarded you by taking you to the best home, the eternal one in the heavens." There's very little known about Mary Moffat Livingstone, but it is known that she walked some of the same roads as her husband, but hers were often quieter, lonelier, and less remembered. She did not lead expeditions or publish journals, but she gave her strength, her knowledge, and her love to the man who did. Behind David Livingstone's courage was her calm, behind his calling was her shared conviction, and behind his legacy was her sacrifice. Though history rarely places her in the spotlight, those who know her story understand that David Livingstone would not have been the same without Mary. David Livingstone is best known as a 19th century Scottish missionary, explorer, and physician who extensively traveled through Africa. His most famous achievements include mapping vast, previously uncharted regions of Central and Southern Africa, including parts of the Zambezi River. In 1855, he became the first European to see and name Victoria Falls, one of the largest waterfalls in the world. His missionary work was not traditional in the sense of establishing churches or converting large numbers of people, as we think of missions today. Instead, he primarily focused on exploration and mapping Africa. However, through his writings and reports, he highlighted the spiritual needs of Africa, which inspired many others to take up the missionary work on the continent after him. So how do people across the world hear about him? And why did they choose to dedicate their lives to reaching the African continent and beyond? Well, let's meet some of the people who followed in his footsteps. As a young man training for Anglican ministry, John Roscoe read Livingstone's published journals, which described his encounters with African tribes and his vision of Christianity spreading across the continent. Livingstone's ability to both preach the gospel and study African cultures intrigued Roscoe. He believed that to be an effective missionary, he had to understand the people he served. He later became a missionary and anthropologist, documenting the traditions of the Ugandan people. James Johnson first encountered Livingstone's story through his widely publicized journals and the news of his death in 1873, which stirred public interest. Livingstone's commitment to both spiritual and physical well-being led Johnson to combine missionary work with photography and medical care. He traveled Africa documenting Livingstone's influence, later settling in Jamaica to establish a medical mission. Horace Waller met Livingstone personally while working on anti-slavery campaigns, and later received letters from him detailing the horrors of the slave trade in Africa. Waller saw Livingstone as a heroic figure who exposed the brutalities of slavery in Africa. And after Livingstone's death, Waller edited the last journals of David Livingstone, ensuring that his call to end slavery and evangelize Africa reached the world. Cecil met Livingstone in person when the missionary arrived in Botswana in the 1840s. Livingstone taught Cecil to read the Bible, and despite later returning to some traditional practices, he spread Christianity among his people, showing that local leaders could be powerful evangelists. As a child in Scotland, Mary Slessor followed Livingstone's adventures through news reports and missionary magazines. Livingstone's willingness to go deep into Africa and live among the people challenged her view of mission work. Determined to follow his example, she left for Nigeria, where she worked to stop the killing of twins and spread the gospel into the deepest reaches of the country. Henry Folds read Livingstone's journals while training as a medical missionary in Scotland. Seeing Livingstone as a model for combining medicine with evangelism, Folds took the same approach, though instead of Africa, he went to Japan, where he opened hospitals and spread Christianity. Frederick Stanley Arnott's father read him stories from Livingstone's books as a child, planting the seed of missionary zeal. So inspired by Livingstone's journeys, he felt called to take the gospel deeper into Central Africa. He walked thousands of miles, bringing Christianity and medical aid to remote regions. Albert Schweitzer read Livingstone's accounts of blending medicine and faith while studying theology. Livingstone's example led Schweitzer to pursue both a medical degree and missionary work. He founded a hospital in Gabon, believing that true Christian service involved caring for both the body and soul. Alexander Mackay, like many others, followed Livingstone's reports in missionary magazines. Mackay saw Livingstone's vision of transforming Africa through both faith and practical skills. He traveled to Uganda teaching Christian doctrines while introducing new technologies. Peter Cameron Scott grew up in Scotland, where Livingstone was a national hero. His journals inspired Scott to consider Africa. Scott went on to found the African Inland Mission, taking Christianity further into Africa's interior. His work laid the foundation for many future missionary efforts. Dan Crawford read Livingstone's accounts as a young man and attended missionary meetings where Livingstone's legacy was discussed. He embraced Livingstone's method of deeply integrating into African society, living among the Luba people, and learning their customs before sharing the gospel with them. As an African American growing up post-Civil War, William Henry Shepherd saw Livingstone as a role model for what Black missionaries could achieve. Often called the Black Livingstone, he was deeply influenced by David Livingstone's legacy and sought to continue the missionary efforts in Africa. He co-founded the African Presbyterian Congo Mission in 1830, and he traveled extensively among the Kuba people and other groups in Congo, preaching the gospel in their language. Roland Bingham's church frequently spoke about Livingstone's legacy, stirring in him a missionary passion. Inspired by Livingstone's belief that Africa's interior must be reached, Bingham co-founded the Sudan Interior Mission to evangelize remote regions. As David Livingstone's son, Thomas Livingstone was immersed in his father's missionary legacy. In 1873, he joined the London Missionary Society and was assigned to the Central African Mission. His efforts were primarily focused in the region that is now Malawi. Despite his dedication, Thomas faced numerous challenges, including health issues and logistical difficulties, which hindered the long-term success of his missionary endeavors. John Mackenzie learned about Livingstone through Scottish missionary circles and admired his vision for Africa. He took on Livingstone's work of advocating for African rights and preventing exploitation by European powers. George Grenfell read the last journals of David Livingstone and felt called to follow in his footsteps. George Grenfell was often seen as Livingstone's successor. He worked tirelessly in the Congo River Basin, spreading the gospel and mapping the region. David Livingstone's life sparked a movement that went far beyond his own time. From missionaries to doctors, from explorers to African leaders, his influence continues today through those who carried his vision forward. When we hear the name David Livingstone, we often imagine a solitary missionary explorer walking tens of thousands of miles through the vast landscape of the African continent. But David Livingstone wasn't alone in this story. He had a family, a wife, and 6 children. Their names today are barely remembered. If you type their names into the internet, you can hardly find any details about them. Their stories are nearly lost in the shadow of time. Today we want to highlight as best as possible the children of missionaries David and Mary Livingstone, and we begin with their son, Robert Moffat Livingstone. Robert was named for his grandfather, missionary pioneer Robert Moffat. Robert spent much of his early childhood in southern Africa, where he showed determination and fearlessness from a young age. After moving to Scotland for schooling, his unsettled early life and lack of formal education made adapting difficult for the boy. Raised by 2 strict aunts, he struggled with discipline and changed schools often. After his mother's death in 1862, Robert impulsively tried to return to Africa to find his father, but a letter caught up to him forbidding him by his father from continuing his journey. Instead, he traveled to Cape Town, ran out of money, and worked his way to the United States. In 1863, under the name Rupert Vincent, he enlisted in the Union Army when he was 17 years old, though he claimed to be 21. Now, if the information that I've read is correct, and there is some uncertainty in the documents that I read regarding these details, but it's believed that Robert served in the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment during the war between the states. It said that Robert was wounded and captured at Laurel Hill, Virginia. He was then imprisoned in the notorious Salisbury Confederate prison camp, where overcrowding, starvation, and disease were rampant. And it's believed that on December 5th, 1864, at the age of 18, Robert died of his wounds. One more lost life in the brutal conflict of the war between the states. The Livingstones' second child, Agnes Livingstone, was born on June 13, 1847, in South Africa, when her father was 34 and her mother, Mary, was 26. We know little to nothing of Agnes's childhood, but there are records that she married an Alexander Lowe Bruce on July 27, 1875, in Hamilton, Lancashire, Scotland. They were the parents of at least 2 sons and 2 daughters, and she lived in Scotland until her death on April 20th, 1912. Her children were named David Livingstone Bruce, Mary Livingstone Bruce, Alexander Livingstone Bruce, and Annie Livingstone Bruce. The Livingstones' third child, Thomas Steele Livingstone, was born on March 7, 1849. He was named for a close friend and traveling companion, Thomas Montague Steele. Thomas is believed to have studied in Glasgow with the Free Church. He then joined the University Mission and arrived in East Africa in January 1862. Thomas had some sort of accident in 1871 or 1872 that affected his health, and he went to Egypt to recoup and passed away in Alexandria on March 15, 1876. The Livingstones' fourth child, Elizabeth Livingstone, was born on August 4, 1850 in Kolobeng, South Africa. Elizabeth lived for only 6 weeks, passing away on September 18, 1850. The Livingstones' fifth child was born on September 15, 1851, in South Africa. He was named for William Cotton Oswell, who explored the Kalahari Desert and located Lake Ngami with David Livingstone. I know very little else about William Oswell, but I did come across the obituary notice in a paper for William, and it says, William Oswell Livingstone, third and last surviving son of the famous African traveler, died recently at St. Albans, England, shortly after he had dictated a congratulatory letter to Stanley. Mr. Livingstone was born in South Africa in 1851. The Livingstones' sixth child was born on November 16, 1858. She was born in Kuruman, South Africa. She married Francis Wilson on August 7, 1881 in Cumberland, England, and they were the parents of 1 son and 1 daughter, Ruth Mary Wilson and Dr. Rupert Francis Wilson. She died in Scotland at the age of 81 on December 4, 1839. When I began researching for this episode on Livingstone's children, I had anticipated learning more about them, being able to share more details about their lives, and perhaps as I began to read more into Livingstone's letters and diaries and journals, there may be more details that I come across, so this might be something we come back to later in the future to discuss more about him and his family. But this is all I have for you at the moment. So what I want to do is show you a little insight into Livingstone and his writings to his children. I have a letter that is addressed to his 4 living children at the time. This is written in February 1853. Anna would not have been born at time of this letter writing. But I'm going to read this letter to you and talk a little bit about it at the end. So it reads, My dear children, I often think of you, and when I see the places where we outspanned and where you played together, I feel our separation very keenly. Oh, how I should like to see you all again once more. As this cannot be, I must do the next best thing and write to you, and then put it into Mamma's letters. And when she has read her own, she will read yours for you. Now then, I think I see Robert and Agnes and Thomas and Oswell all together, and I say, Rumela bana bami, for though you are in England now, I am still in the land where this language is spoken. But though I call you my children, it is from custom, for you are now the children of Jesus. I have given you back to him, and you are in his care. He is your father, and a kinder, better father never was. But you yourselves must look up to him to be your father and guide. And you must be brave little children to him. You know what it is to be brave. Robert was a brave little fellow when he was very small, but something or somebody frightened him, and then he always ran to the wagon whenever he saw the oxen come near, and Agnes and Thomas always ran too. That was not brave. Mr. Oswell was brave. He was not afraid to go to elephants and shoot these big, frightful animals. Now I want you to be brave too, but not in the way of fighting lions and elephants. I wish you to be brave servants of Jesus. I wish you not to be afraid to own him. If others are ashamed to say, I won't sin because I love Jesus, my dear ones must say, I am his. I am the child of a king. I fear to sin against him. There are many naughty boys and girls who will laugh at you if you fear to sin or do and say naughty things. But never fear a laugh or mocking. Brave ones don't care who laughs if Jesus smiles. Mr. Oswald would not care though a lion roared at him, so you must not care that the devil stirs up his children to mock and vex you. Everyone has something to plague him. We must escape troubles all the way through life. Those who try to escape troubles by sinning and trying to please sinners by being like them get the greatest trouble of all in the end. The best way is to bravely bear our burdens and always think of the end of all things. You must work. You must learn. Learning must be your work while you are young. Bravely set yourselves to it, and you will find it gives you more pleasure than playing always will do. You must play too, but learning, that must never be let alone. And when learning, you are gaining knowledge of things worth knowing. It is worth knowing how to read and write. At first, it is irksome to learn and irksome to read, because you don't well understand what you read. But when you understand what is read, oh, then how nice. I would not be without the knowledge of reading or writing for anything in the world. You must bravely set yourselves to conquer reading and writing, and then your young years must be spent in gaining a knowledge of things, persons, countries, languages worth knowing. Suppose you could all read now, and should read of David, king of Israel. What a brave man he was. What an open, true, patient, valiant soul he was. He would not kill even his enemy when he had him in his power and asleep. And Joseph and Abraham, and many other brave ones who feared only to sin against Jesus. Or you might read of Paul. What a heroic soul he was. He will never be forgotten in this world. His brave good deeds will shine forever. Would it not be better to be like such than all the poor degraded children of the devil, slaves of sin? And remember too that if you do not, each of you, ask Jesus to make you his, you will be the children of Satan, a hard and bad master. I shall work for the glory of Christ's kingdom, fever or no fever. All the intelligent men who direct our society and understand the nature of my movement support me warmly. A few I understand in Africa, in writing home, have styled my efforts as wandering. The very word contains a lie coiled like a serpent in its bosom. It means traveling without an object, or uselessly. I am not performing the duty of writing you. If this was termed dawdling, it would be as true as the other. But I have given mortal offense to a portion of the brethren by writing that all the Hottentot churches should be made independent at once. They have been supplied with the gospel for half a century, and are now better able to support their pastors than you are. To those who have been accustomed to looking upon small Hottentot villages, the inhabitants of which are all nearly converted, as fields involving the most excruciating responsibility, my depreciation of their fields and magnification of the heathen world beyond seem twofold heresy. I have actually seen letters to the directors in which I am gravely charged with holding the views of the Plymouth Brethren. So very sure am I that I am in the path which God's providence has pointed out as that by which Christ's kingdom is to be promoted. If the society should object, I would consider it my duty to withdraw from it. But at present, in accordance with the plan fully stated to the society and public before setting out, I proceeded to try and open up a short path to the west coast. We are immortal till our work is done. If I am cut off by fever, my efforts are not longer needed by him who knows what is best. Very kind love to Mother and the sisterhood. No letter from any of you greeted my eyes, though I have heard nothing of the world for 10 months previously. An opportunity occurred, and a very few letters came, all with one exception from those who were not my kinsmen according to the flesh. The exception showed the propriety of the precept clear unto his wife. I think I must praise you now, seeing scolding has not effect. You are wonderfully philosophic, acting, I suppose, on the advice of Solomon, not to be too hasty in answering. This is very laudable, but I suspect your letters may be in the way, or you may be excessively busy in your undertakings. I shall therefore conclude, as the boards do, with I am yours with good expectations. David Livingstone. Though thousands of miles from his children in distance and months away from news of their daily lives, Livingstone did what he could to instill the values he held dear to his 4, at the time, children through his letters. Through this letter you can see various lessons and values that Livingstone is attempting to convey across the many miles to his children. One is spiritual priority. The children are reminded that they belong to Jesus, not just through their earthly father, and that they must look to him as their guide and protector. Secondly, that true bravery is spiritual. Courage is not physical toughness, but moral and spiritual steadfastness in the face of temptation, ridicule, or difficulty. Third, value of education. Learning is a lifelong pursuit, an essential preparation for serving God and others. Though hard at first, knowledge will bring joy and empowerment. 4. Avoiding sin and peer pressure. Livingstone warns about the dangers of sin and urges his children not to give in to naughty boys and girls or mockers. Fifth is purpose in life. He wants his children to find meaning in serving Jesus and contributing to the spread of the gospel and the good of others. And lastly, family and kindness. He shows concern for family unity and kindness towards their mother and each other. Livingstone's letters portray him as a deeply loving, devout, and principled father. He blends spiritual instruction with fatherly affection and practical advice, aiming to nurture children who are not only intelligent and educated, but also morally brave and faithful. And just as Livingstone used biblical examples to shape the hearts of those under his care, so should we, whether as parents, siblings, friends, mentors, or leaders, be intentional about using God's word to speak truth and hope to those around us. We all have circles of influence, and within them opportunities to model faith, speak truth, and encourage others towards righteousness. Like Livingstone, let us be bold in our faith, grounded in Scripture, and driven by love, not only to live rightly ourselves, but to guide others towards Christ. Before David Livingstone became a legendary missionary and explorer, and long before he crossed Africa, he was a young man searching for purpose. So what helped to set him on this path? Well, it began with a pamphlet, a fiery, heartfelt appeal written by a German missionary named Karl Gutzlaff. Gutzlaff was no ordinary missionary. He spoke fluent Chinese, dressed like the people he served, and believed that missionaries should carry medicine and scripture hand in hand. In 1833, he published this impassioned call to Christians around the world to bring the gospel and healing to the people of China. Livingstone read it, and then everything changed. This document stirred his soul and shaped his decision to train as a medical doctor and go into missions. First, dreaming of China, and eventually going to Africa. Now, what you're about to hear is that original appeal, the very words that helped launch one of the most remarkable missionary journeys in history. Now, we first introduced this pamphlet in our second episode of our David Livingstone series, David Livingstone's Education, Preparing for a Life of Missionary Service. So today we thought we would share Gutzlaff's powerful call, his urgent plea for laborers, with all of you. An appeal to Christians in behalf of China. In all cases where pecuniary aid is required, it is necessary to point out the excellency of the object, in which we ask the cooperation of our fellow Christians. Benevolent institutions at the present day are so numerous that appeals to Christian sympathy are generally met either with indifference or that languid zeal which has so many channels into which to divide itself that its forces can never be concentrated in a single point. There are, however, exceptions, and many are enthusiastic in the promulgation of the gospel. We look in the present instance for something more than mere money, nor have we much to say in behalf of the great work. This can speak for itself. And so far as regards the means to accomplish it, we are confident and know by experience that God will supply them. We only wish to discharge our obligations of making known to all our fellow Christians the feeble beginnings of a great and glorious work, which, if properly followed, will lead to the most glorious results. We would not, however, be too sanguine in our expectations, nor visionary in our predictions, but simply look to God, who has begun the good work, and who will, doubtless, also accomplish it. Let us not, on the other hand, be too diffident. A firm reliance upon His almighty power will carry those who enter upon the work through all dangers, and things unheard of or considered impossible can soon be accomplished. The writer of this considers himself an unworthy instrument, not in the language of affectation, but in truth. He desires ardently that his name may be forgotten, since it is written in heaven, provided the holy cause of God fill the mind of every reader. China has hitherto been considered inaccessible to the gospel, with its 350 millions of immortal souls, with its extensive sway over numerous hordes of semi-barbarians, and with its many other vassals. It presents an unbroken stronghold of Satan, which is fortified by the anti-national laws and made impregnable by ancient customs. What a painful sight to behold these myriads in Satan's thraldom, in the darkness of degrading idolatry, without a God and Savior, and withal to behold the mountains of impossibilities which seem to render their borders impenetrable to the light of truth. We have pity on barbarous nations, which in a state of savage life dishonor human nature by the abomination of heathenism. But here we meet a people endowed with a good share of natural understanding, polished by the hand of civilization, and superior to the Mohammedan Asiatic, degraded by the brutal Buddhism, led astray by Taoism, and estranged by atheism. Whoever has beheld these millions of China in such a state, and who cherishes in his bosom the feeling of common humanity, will pity them. But a soul touched by the divine Saviour's love will weep for them, and pray earnestly that the salvation of our God may be granted unto them. Alas, China has found few advocates in Christendom. We have been content to say a few words upon the subject, and after having lamented their lot, we have left them to themselves. There has been a general excuse. We can find no access to them. The government counteracts all efforts to enlighten them. We must be satisfied with instructing the settlers in the Indian archipelago, and wait till the barrier of national exclusion is removed. At the same time, we may prepare the scriptures in their language, issue tracts, and render the study of their difficult language easy by philological works. We may open schools to instruct the youth in our settlements, and thus imbue their minds with the doctrines of Christianity. These attempts are highly laudable, and the individuals engaged in the work are praiseworthy, and their labors and their zeal will find a rich reward in eternity. It is unnecessary to speak of the success which has followed their efforts, nor need we name those conspicuous individuals whose labors of patience have contributed so greatly towards opening the way of evangelizing China. Instead, however, of being satisfied with what has been done, we ought to press forward till we have found access to the empire itself. Are there any obstacles too great for the Lord, who has commanded us to preach the gospel to all nations, and at the same time promised to be with us till the end of the world? Consideration of this kind ought to make us bold in attacking the bulwarks of Satan, even though the whole world were in array against us. If the visionary project of subjecting all mankind to the spiritual jurisdiction of the Pope could embolden men to enter this empire at the peril of their lives, how much more ought we to be undaunted in the work of God, to subject this nation to the sway of Christ, the Lord of all. We aim at nothing but the glory of God. The Roman Catholic missionaries overcome all difficulties by their perseverance, and gradually gain ground. And we, being clad with the armor of God, are we not able to conquer? When they entered China, the intercourse between distant nations was exceedingly imperfect. The intercourse with China, very little. The prejudices of the Chinese against foreigners was much stronger than at present. But notwithstanding all these impediments, they found their way into every part of the empire. In our days, the ships fly through the ocean, our mercantile intercourse is on the increase, and national antipathy is partly worn away. Possessing now all these advantages, is there not a greater prospect of success? But still, the same system of national exclusion is in force, and in point of liberal intercourse, we have scarcely gained anything. In other countries, we have had to meet more formidable obstacles, and they have been overcome. Yet in China we despair. Witness the Romanish missionaries. See with what a perseverance they withstand the sweeping regulations of national exclusion. We disapprove entirely of their measures. We detest the cause as far as mere popery is concerned. But to stand firm till death, boldly to brave all dangers, to accomplish the end, is heroism, and highly recommendable to Protestant missionaries. The writer of this was deeply impressed with these and similar considerations, when, against the wishes of his friends, he ventured upon a voyage to China. Having left Siam, his former station, he embarked on board a Chinese junk for Tianjin, a large trading town in the neighborhood of Peking. He was weak with sickness, borne down with grief, and in the most feeble situation imaginable. Though he despaired of life, he thought it better to die in defense of the great cause than to linger on a sick bed. After arriving in the Chaozhou district on the eastern frontiers of Canton, he saw himself surrounded by millions who had never heard the sound of salvation. He distributed books which were gladly received. This roused his sinking spirits. The voyage to Fujian and Shandong were fraught with disasters, and he had his full share of sufferings. Instead of finding the mandarins vigilant to watch his motions, he met with none, and was quite at liberty to converse with the natives who visited him from curiosity. Tianjin in Hebei province furnishes a large field for giving medical assistance. This opened the way for religious instructions. His company was sought, and he was scarcely noticed by the government. After visiting Manchuria territory, he returned to Canton, where he was kindly received by Dr. Morrison. It appeared that we might carry on the work of an evangelist without involving us in any danger, and that the Chinese government was by no means so hostile as to preclude every attempt to promote the glorious gospel. This was in the year 1831. Meanwhile, the attention of the British factory in China had been directed towards the northern ports of the Chinese Empire, which in days of yore had been visited by English ships. They therefore fitted out an expedition, to which the writer was appointed surgeon and interpreter. The Lord Amherst, this was the name of the ship sent on this enterprise, went up the coast in March 1832. Unfavorable winds detained us a long time in different ports of Canton province. Mr. L., the supercargo, gave me full liberty to distribute the word of eternal life, which was everywhere joyfully received. After arriving in Shemen Harbor, the greatest emporium of Fujian, we were treated as enemies and found but few opportunities of making known the riches of the gospel to a people who claimed me as a native of their district. We then visited the Punghua Islands and from thence stretched over to Taiwan. No interference of the mandarins hindered the people from intercourse with us. We had many visitors, and the demand for Christian books was great. Christianity once flourished on this island, but we now found no vestiges of it remaining. At Fuzhou also, the capital of Fujian, we were unshackled in our proceedings. The crowd of natives who thronged us for medical assistance and books was immense. We here met with Roman Catholics. They informed us that they were printing the New Testament. Nothing astonished them more than that we had been able to publish it in their own language. The only thing they regretted was that we should distribute these precious books to the ignorant and blind heathens. Hastening toward Zhejiang, we entered the port of Ningbo. The natives here are a very amiable race, and of all whom we have hitherto met, the most promising as regards to the introduction of the gospel among them. This opinion was still more corroborated by our visit to the Jingtang Island. After having stayed a considerable time at Shanghai, in Jiangsu Province, which with Anhui Province formerly bore the name of Jiangnan, we departed for Shandong, and thence passed over to Korea. In all our excursions on shore we scattered the word of eternal life. Neither in Zhejiang nor Jiangnan did we find the people prejudiced against it. They read it eagerly, and I can say now, not in vain. As far as my knowledge extends, the mandarins interfered only twice with the distribution of books, and then they made but a feeble effort to discountenance what they could not disprove. Wei, the lieutenant governor of Fujian, asked for a set of Christian books, and sent them up for examination to the emperor, Daoguang, the reigning monarch, who has never shown hostility to the Catholics, passed no censure upon the glorious gospel. Magnates at Pekin, who examined into its doctrines, did not denounce it, but they withheld likewise their approbation. On our first arrival at Korea, we met with no opposition in making known the truth of the eternal God. But afterwards, when we came in contact with the royal commissioners, we found that the door was shut. However, the king received a whole copy of the Scriptures in 21 volumes, and a double set of all the tracts, among the presents which we sent him. Notwithstanding the present prohibitions and the anti-national character of both of the government and the nation, the good seed is sown in this remote country, and will ere long gloriously spring up and yield fruit. From some unaccountable cause we found the Luchuans, whom we first visited, prejudiced against the word of life. This remark, however, applies only to the government. The people were anxious to obtain copies of the New Testament and of our numerous tracts. As often as they were freed from the presence of their rulers, they eagerly pressed forward to obtain from us these books. After having returned to Macau in September 1832, I received several offers to go upon a new expedition, of which the uttermost limits were to be to Manchuria, Tartary. Though this new attempt was on some accounts highly objectionable, nevertheless I embarked, and entered the service of a great commercial house as surgeon and interpreter. We arrived in October, met tremendous gales, and arrived in November in Manchuria, Tartary. Whilst I scattered the seed of eternal life in these distant regions, and the joy of doing so from the southern shores up to the Chinese Great Wall, our ship struck the ground, and we suffered the most intense cold. But when God had saved us from this imminent peril, we directed our course to Shanghai. Most joyfully were we received by the natives. 6 months before they had read our books. Now they understood their contents, and wanted a fuller instruction in the way of life. During our further progress in the northern parts of Xinjiang Province and among the Chusan Islands, I had ample reason to praise our glorious Savior for opening so wide a door to the introduction of the Holy Gospel. All that I had formerly seen was nothing compared with the ardent desire now evinced by the natives to obtain books. Many, many thousands of the plainest essays upon the most essential doctrines had found their way to all the adjacent districts, And had I 1,000,000 of tracts and 50,000 copies of the Scriptures, they would all have been scattered amongst eager readers. My most sanguine expectations have been far surpassed. I marvel and adore in the dust. Curiosity, I confess, had a great share in rousing the people to be impetuous in their demands. But at the same time, I see it in a higher hand. Are the bowels of mercy of compassionate Savior shut against these millions? Does his all-comprehending love exclude these millions? Before him, China is not shut. He, the almighty conqueror of death and hell, will open the gates of heaven for these myriads. He has opened them. When we arrived at Fujian in our return, my large store of books was exhausted, and I had to send away numerous applicants empty-handed. After a dangerous voyage, we returned to Linten Island, near Macau, April 29, 1833. Whilst writing this, I anticipate the pleasure of being again very soon in the northern ports of China, and of remaining there for an indefinite time. We have experienced many severe trials, and have had to struggle with some insurmountable difficulties, but God has never forsaken us. Our communication with the greatest part of this extensive coast, where we have had intercourse with more than 50 millions of Chinese, may now be considered as established. Let us not, however, expect too great results from these very feeble attempts, but let us believe that the Almighty God, who has granted his blessing on the beginning of the work, will not suffer China to carry on any longer her system of exclusion. Appalling difficulties may frequently arise, but what are they before an omnipotent God? The decree of evangelizing China is passed in heaven. What therefore can all the contrary decrees of the pretended Son of Heaven avail? I am happy to say the supreme government at Peking has hitherto not denounced evangelical doctrines as dangerous, but merely censured them as unclassical. Yet should they dare to denounce them, it would only rouse the spirit of the nation to inquire further into the truth of the gospel. But let me not draw too favorable a picture of the Chinese nation. Though they harbor no peculiar prejudices against foreign creeds, they are entirely engrossed with the things of this world. Their hearts are steeled against religious impressions, whilst they satisfy their minds with the punctilious observance of mere rites. We are, however, by no means dejected on this account. It is the work of God in which we are engaged. The Savior has promised to send the Holy Spirit, and we trust that by his powerful agency a glorious change will be wrought. The wild migratory barbarians, whose hordes once started from the frontiers of China and went on, inundating and conquering all Europe, were brought to the obedience of the gospel when amalgamated with the German tribes. Why should not the Chinese be benefited by its celestial rays? The writer addresses himself to simple-hearted Christians. He beseeches them to pray earnestly that God may send the Holy Spirit from on high to enlighten the darkness. He wishes to speak to kindred souls who are ready to sacrifice their all that China may be evangelized and Christ glorified. Is there no body who, having the goods of this world, would dedicate both his substance and himself to the great cause, by becoming a traveling preacher in China without burdening any society? Among the thousands of English vessels, is there none which will eventually perform their voyage along all the coast, visiting every place in the way, to benefit the heathen? We have no intention of draining public funds which are already so much exhausted, but we wish to see individual efforts, which, if well directed, will produce most glorious results. May the Father of all them who adore our Lord Jesus Christ in spirit and truth call some of his children to these regions where there is abundance of work and but few laborers. Millions of Bibles and tracts will be wanted, and I trust that these will be furnished, persuaded that he who opens the door for the introduction of the gospel will also furnish the means for its propagation. As you heard in this appeal, Gutzlaff doesn't just describe the spiritual needs of China. He exposes the church's lack of urgency, the missed opportunities, and the excuses that are so easily made. He calls not only for missionaries, but for hearts fully yielded to God's purpose, people willing to risk comfort, reputation, and even life itself for the sake of the gospel. He reminds us that the harvest is vast, but the laborers are few, not because the fields aren't ready, but because too many hesitate to go. In his appeal, he doesn't ask for perfect people. He asks for willing ones. Gutzlaff spoke at a time when China had only just begun to open its ports, yet he saw an open door and urged the church to walk through it boldly. Now, nearly 200 years later, his words still resonate. The needs may look different, but the call remains the same. So we ask that you take a moment to reflect. What part might you have in this ongoing mission to reach the world with the gospel? In John 4, verse 35, where Jesus is speaking, it says, "Say ye not, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." For 32 years, David Livingstone labored in Africa. He established mission stations and explored the vast continent from coast to coast, searching for routes through the desert and interior regions. His aim was to open the way for other missionaries. Yet one aspect of his legacy that is often overlooked is how few people he personally saw come to faith in Christ. As the Apostle Paul said, some plant, some water, but God gives the increase. Every believer has a role in the work of the gospel. In Livingstone's case, we don't see much visible reaping, but we do see a life devoted to planting the seeds of the gospel that others could water, and in time, God would give the increase. There was, however, one clear example where Livingstone's planting bore visible fruit. That was in the life of Chief Shishele of the Bakwan people, a man in whom the gospel seed was planted, nurtured, and brought to life through Livingstone's faithful labor. This video dives into Shishele and David Livingstone, how they met, the challenges they faced, and why Shishele's conversion, though quite controversial, became one of the most significant in the early history of African Christianity. There are various accounts of what happened in Shishele's early life. For this video, we will share the account that Livingstone gave in his book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, and excerpts from the personal life of David Livingstone, and a book that I found recently on Amazon, and it's also on eBay, Shishele, a book published in 1954 by the former resident commissioner of the area, Anthony Sillery. So let's go back and begin at the beginning. In about the year 1810, there was born to Chief Matswasel and his wife, Sejelo, a son and heir, Shishele. Matswasel seemed to have been a capable chief to lead his men in war, or at least persuasive enough to enlist the aid of the right allies at the right time to defeat his enemies. But according to accounts, he was harsh, cruel, and had an ego that would be his downfall. When Shishele was between 10 and 11 years old, the headsman of the Bakwains conspired to assassinate Matswasala, because he thought it was within his rights as the chief to take the headsman's wives for himself. He was killed, and several men tried to take over the rule of the people. Now, Livingstone gives a brief account of how the chiefdom was returned to Shishele. The children being spared, their friends invited Sebetwana, the chief of Makolo, who was then in those parts, to reinstate them in the chieftainship. Sebetwana surrounded the town of the Bakwains by night, and just as it began to dawn, his herald proclaimed in a loud voice that he was come to revenge the death of Matswasel. This was followed by Sebetwa's people beating loudly on their shields all around the town. The panic was tremendous, and the rush like that from a theater on fire, while the Makolo used their javelins on the terrified Bakwains, with a dexterity which they alone can employ. Sebetwa had given orders to his men to spare the sons of the chief, and one of them, meeting Shishele, put him in ward by giving him such a blow on the head with a club as to render him insensible. The usurper was put to death, and Shishele, reinstated in his chieftainship, felt much attached to Sebetwa. The circumstances here noticed ultimately led me, that was David Livingstone, as will be seen by and by, into the new, well-watered country, to which this same Sebetwa had preceded me by many years. Shishele married the daughters of 3 of his under-chiefs, who had, on account of their blood relationship, stood by him in adversity. This is one of the modes adopted for cementing the allegiance of a tribe. The government is patriarchal, each man being, by virtue of paternity, chief of his own children. They build their huts around his, and the greater number of children, the more his importance increases. Hence, children are estimated one of the greatest blessings, and are always treated kindly. It is believed by Sillery that Seychelles officially regained his father's chiefdom when he was about 19 years old. Now, in the intervening years between the ages of 19 and 30, when Seychelles meets Livingstone, there is much wandering from place to place. There's battles. Things are done as Seychelles tries to consolidate control, moves people away from those who want to harm them, and as the Backwaynes grow in number. Now, Seychelles had heard of Livingstone as early as 1841, and it's possible that they met very briefly, but it wasn't until 1846, following Livingstone's differences with missionary Edwards at Mbatsa, that Livingstone moved into the region where Seychelles was at and found Seychelles. Now, Seychelles had been enraged at Livingstone for not visiting him the year before, and had even threatened him with mischief. It happened that his only child was ill when the missionary arrived, and also the child of one of his principal men. Livingstone's treatment of both was successful, and Seychelles had not an angry word for Livingstone. Seychelles had many questions for Livingstone, and we have Livingstone's own account of one particular question and Livingstone's answer. So Livingstone says, on the first occasion in which I ever attempted to hold a public religious service, he, Seychelles, remarked that it was the custom of his nation, when any new subject was brought before them, to put questions to them, and he begged me to allow him to do the same in this case. On expressing my entire willingness to answer his questions, he inquired if my forefathers knew of a future judgment. I replied in the affirmative, and began to describe the scene of the great white throne, and him who shall sit on it, from whose face the heaven and earth shall flee away. Seychelles said, "You startle me. These words make all my bones to shake. I have no more strength in me. But my forefathers were living at the same time yours were, and how is it that they did not send them word about these terrible things sooner? They all passed away into darkness, without knowing whither they were going." Livingstone says, I got out of the difficulty by explaining the geographical barriers in the north, and the gradual spread of knowledge from the south, to which we first had access by means of ships, and I expressed my belief that, as God had said, the whole world would yet be enlightened by the gospel. What a question the Seychelles asked. How many a missionary before has heard a similar question? You know, your forefathers knew of this coming judgment of the Savior, and no one came to tell us. Allow this to be a reminder to us to share the good news with others around us. Even in this world of the internet, religious materials galore, there are many around the world, and possibly even next door, who have never heard that they are a sinner in need of a Savior, and that Savior came, lived, died, and rose again, that their sins could be forgiven. As soon as he, Seychelles, had an opportunity of learning, he set himself to read with great attention. Mr. Oswell gave him his first lesson in figures, and he acquired the alphabet on the first day of my residence there. He was by no means an ordinary specimen of the people, for I never went into the town, but I was pressed to hear him read some chapters of the Bible. Isaiah was a great favorite with him, and he was wont to say this phrase, "He was a fine man, that Isaiah. He knew how to speak." Now, seeing me anxious that his people should believe the words of Christ, he once said, "Do you imagine these people will ever believe by your merely talking to them? I can make them do nothing except by thrashing them. And if you like, I shall call my headmen, and with our whips of rhinoceros hide, we will soon make them all believe together." The idea of using entreaty and persuasion to subjects to become Christians, whose opinions on no other matter would he condescend to ask, was especially surprising to him. He considered that they ought only to be too happy to embrace Christianity at his command. Now, during the space of 2.5 years, Seychelles continued to profess to his people his full conviction of the truth of Christianity, and in all discussions on the subject he took that side, acting at the same time in an upright manner in all the relations of life. He felt the difficulty of his situation long before I did, and often said, "Oh, I wish you had come to this country before I became entangled in the meshes of our customs." In fact, he was in a predicament because he could not get rid of his many wives, without appearing to be ungrateful to their parents, who had done so much for him in his adversity. In the hope that others would be induced to join him in his attachment to Christianity, he asked me to begin family worship with him in his house. I did so, and by was surprised to hear how well he conducted the prayer in his own simple and beautiful style, for he was quite a master of his own language. At this time we were suffering from the effects of a drought, and none except his family, whom he ordered to attend, came near his meetings. In former times, he said, when the chief was fond of hunting, all his people got dogs and became fond of hunting too. If he was fond of dancing or music, all showed a liking to these amusements too. If the chief loved beer, they would all rejoice in strong drink. But in this case it is different. I love the word of God, and not one of my brethren will join me. So Shelley continued to make a consistent profession for about the space of 3 years, and perceiving at last some of the difficulties of his case and also feeling compassion for the poor women who were by far the best of our scholars, Livingstone says, I had no desire that she should be in any hurry to make a full profession by baptism and putting away all his wives but one. When he did at last apply for baptism, I simply asked him how he, having the Bible in hand and able to read it, thought he ought to act. He went home, gave each of his wives new clothing, and all his own goods which they had been accustomed to keep in their huts for him, and sent them to their parents with an intimation that he had no fault to find with them, but that in parting with them he wishes to follow the will of God. Now he did keep one wife. I don't remember what her name is off the top of my head, but he did keep one. He had 4 wives, and he sent 3 back to their families. Livingstone tells of their baptism and says, on the day in which he and his children were baptized, great numbers came to see the ceremony. Some thought, from a rumor circulated by enemies to Christianity in the South, that the converts would be made to drink an infusion of dead men's brains, and were astonished to find that the water only was used at baptism. Seeing several of the old men actually in tears during the service, I asked them afterwards the cause of their weeping. They said they were crying to see their father, so far left to himself. They seemed to think that I had thrown the glamour over him, and that he had become mine. Here commenced an opposition which we had not previously experienced. All the friends of the divorced wives became the opponents of our religion. The attendance at school and church diminished to very few besides the chief's own family. They all treated us still with respectful kindness, but to Shelley himself they said things which, as he often remarked, had they ventured on in former times, would have cost them their lives. It was trying, after all we had done, to see our labors so little appreciated. But we had sown the good seed, and we had no doubt but it will yet spring up, though we may not live to see the fruit. Over time, Shelley gradually reverted to some of his old habits, and when Livingstone learned that one of Shelley's former wives had given birth many months after having been sent away, a child later confirmed to be Shelley's, Livingstone removed Shelley from church fellowship. And from this point forward, it gets a little sketchy again, the history of Shelley. But after Livingstone left the Bakwan people, it is believed that Shelley led church services for his people, teaching them to read the Bible and spreading the good news, which eventually led to the Bakwan to Christianity. He became a sort of missionary to other tribes, and after resisting the Boers, the Bakwan became a refuge for many, forming a strong Christian society. By the time of his death, Shelley ruled over 30,000 people, far more than when Livingstone first met him. But despite this, missionaries saw him as a contradiction. He returned to rain-making, which was what the chief of a tribe was supposed to do. He practiced polygamy and used traditional rituals, yet knew the Bible deeply and often outwitted missionaries with scripture. We read of the last year of Shelley's life, an account written by the assistant commissioner of that region in early 1892. It says, in Shelley, the once powerful chief of the Bakwan people, being now very old and incapable of taking any part of the management of the affairs of the tribe, has handed the chieftainship of it to his son, Sebele. He is now confined to his bed and not likely to live much longer. Shelley died on September 25th, 1892, and was laid to rest in his cattle corral, following ancient customs, and was mourned by his people. David Livingstone may not have seen many direct conversions during his years in Africa, but his faithfulness planted seeds that bore lasting fruit, and one of those seeds took root in Chief Shelley, a man whose journey was anything but simple. Though flawed and sometimes inconsistent, Shelley became one of the most influential Christian leaders in southern Africa. It is believed that he translated scripture, taught his people to read, led church services, and eventually helped shape a Christian identity that was deeply African in expression. Livingstone planted, others watered, and in Shelley's life, God gave the increase. This is a legacy worth remembering, not just of a missionary, but of a chief who, in his own way, helped bring the gospel to his people. My heart beats fast, but I must not let my face betray my emotions, lest it shall detract from the dignity of a white man appearing under such extraordinary circumstances. So I did that which I thought was most dignified. I pushed back the crowds and, passing from the rear, walked down a long avenue of people until I came in front of the semicircle of Arabs, before which stood the white man with the gray beard. As I advanced slowly towards him, I noticed he was pale, that he looked wearied and wan, that he had gray whiskers and mustache, that he wore a bluish cloth cap with faded gold band, and that he had on a red-sleeved waistcoat and a pair of gray tweed trousers. I would have run to him, only I was a coward in the presence of such a mob, would have embraced him, but that I did not know how he would receive me. So I did what moral cowardice and false pride suggested was the best thing, walked deliberately to him, took off my hat, and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Before we speak about how Stanley met with Livingstone, let me give a very less than adequate summary of Livingstone's travels between 1858 and 1872. I had hoped to look at this more in depth, but it's quite extensive. There's a lot of details, so we're just going to summarize it for the sake of this series at this time. So in these years, Livingstone undertook some of the most ambitious and influential expeditions into Central and East Africa, driven by his unique blend of religious mission, scientific curiosity, and anti-slavery conviction. His second major journey, the British government-funded Zambezi expedition between 1858 and 1864, aimed to explore the Zambezi River as a potential route for trade, Christian missions, and anti-slavery economic development. Though it was hampered by navigational challenges, particularly the impassable Cahora-Bassa Rapids, and marred by interpersonal conflicts and logistical failures, it led to the significant discovery of Lake Malawi in 1859 and provided valuable scientific and geographical data. When he returned to Britain in 1864, Livingstone faced criticism over the expedition's high cost and limited success, but he defended his work through lectures and publications, notably a narrative of an expedition to the Zambezi and its tributaries, 1865. Undeterred, he launched a final expedition in 1866 with private backing, this time to locate the source of the Nile and investigate the growing East African slave trade. Over the next 7 years, he journeyed through some of the most remote and dangerous parts of the African interior. He meticulously documented geography, natural history, and the brutal realities of the slave trade, most famously witnessing a massacre in 1871 where Arab slavers killed over 400 villagers. But now, let's learn how and why Henry Morton Stanley uttered those memorable words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." So, the lack of authentic news respecting Livingstone touched the hearts of the British people keenly. The question was often asked, why does he not write? We know now that his letters were either lost or deliberately intercepted and destroyed by the Arabs, who were frightened at the thought that the British people should know what Livingstone himself had witnessed. The long silence of the 3 years had led many to believe that he was dead. Demands were made that an expedition should be organized to ascertain if he was yet alive or had suffered death in his heroic attempts to explore Central Africa. But while England was demanding and debating, an American journalist acted. Mr. Bennett of the New York Herald felt that the finding of Livingstone would be a journalistic scoop of the first magnitude. He had watched with interest the career of a young Welshman named Henry Morton Stanley, who had immigrated to and become a citizen of the United States. Believing that Stanley would be just the right man to carry out his idea successfully, Mr. Bennett wired him to come to Paris where he was staying. The interview took place in Mr. Bennett's bedroom at the Grand Hotel. The result was that, after fulfilling certain other details that were specified, Stanley was commissioned to search for Livingstone in earnest, not for an interview, but to discover, and if necessary, extract him, wherever he might be in the heart of Africa. Stanley arrived in Zanzibar on December 31st, 1870, and on the 21st of March, 1871, his expedition was ready to move. In his autobiography, Stanley tells us that it took a compact little force of 3 whites, 31 armed freedmen of Zanzibar as escorts, 153 porters, and 27 pack animals to begin the journey. Equipped with every needful article for a long journey that the experience of many Arabs had suggested, that my own ideas of necessaries for comfort or convenience in illness or health had provided. Its very long composition betrayed its character. There was nothing aggressive in it. Its many bales of cloth and loads of beads and wire, with its assorted packages of provisions and medicine, indicated a peaceful caravan about to penetrate among African tribes accustomed to barter. While its few guns showed a sufficient defensive power against bands of native bandita, offensive measures were utterly out of the question. Stanley, after reaching Anyan Mbe, got caught in a conflict between Arab settlers and Chief Mirambo. He unwisely sided with the Arabs and was forced into a failed retreat. Realizing his mistake too late, he had to take a long, indirect route around Mirambo's territory, which delayed him by nearly a month before he could finally continue his journey toward Ujiji. Friday, November 10th was the eventful day when Livingstone and Stanley met. The story of this meeting has often been told. When the caravan was about half a mile from Ujiji, Stanley's men fired their guns as a salute. Among the dwellers in this Arab colony, consternation prevailed. For the moment, they thought it was Mirambo attacking them. As the people poured forth fully armed, they saw, borne aloft at the head of the caravan, the American flag. This was sufficient to show them that it was a white man's caravan, and with great enthusiasm they escorted the members of the expedition into the town. Stanley says, "I was about to ask one of the nearest to me whether it was true that there is a white man in Ujiji who has just come from the countries west of the lakes, when a tall black man in a long white shirt burst impulsively through the crowd on the right and bending low said, 'Good morning, sir,' in clear, intelligent English. 'Hello,' I said. 'Who are you?' 'I am Susie, sir, the servant of Dr. Livingstone.' 'What? Is Dr. Livingstone here in this town?' 'Yes, sir.' 'But are you sure that it is Dr. Livingstone?' 'Why, I leave him just now, sir.' Before I could express my wonder, a similarly dressed man elbowed his way briskly to me and said, 'Good morning, sir.' 'Are you also a servant of Dr. Livingstone?' I asked. 'Yes, sir. And what is your name?' 'It is Chuma.' 'Oh, the friend of Wikotani.' 'Yes, sir.' 'Well, now that we have met, one of you had better run ahead and tell the doctor of my coming.' The same idea striking Susu's mind, he undertook in his impulsive manner to inform the doctor, and I saw him racing headlong with his white dress streaming behind him like a wind-whipped pennant. As Stanley entered the market-place, he saw the figure of an elderly white man, clad in a red flannel blouse, grey trousers, and a blue cloth gold-banded cap. Bowing, he said, 'Dr. Livingstone, I presume.' Smiling cordially, he lifted his hat and answered briefly, 'Yes.' This ending all speculation on my part, my face betrayed the earnestness of my satisfaction as I extended my hand and added, 'I thank God, doctor, that I have been permitted to see you.' In the warm grasp he gave my hand and the heartiness of his voice, I felt that he was also sincere and earnest as he replied, 'I feel most thankful that I am here to welcome you.' To Livingstone, the coming of Stanley was as the breath of a new life. It relieved his anxieties and enabled him to take that nourishment his wasted body craved, and above all it brought to him messages from the children he loved, and news of the busy world outside. In his journal he says, 'The news made my whole frame thrill. The terrible fate that had befallen France, the telegraphic cables successfully laid in the Atlantic, the election of General Grant, and the death of good Lord Clarendon. Appetite returned, and instead of the sparse, tasteless 2 meals a day, I ate 4 times daily, and in a week began to feel strong. I am not of a demonstrative turn, as cold, indeed, as we islanders are usually reputed to be, but this disinterested kindness of Mr. Bennet, so nobly carried into effect by Mr. Stanley, was simply overwhelming. Really do feel extremely grateful, and at the same time I am a little ashamed at not being more worthy of the generosity." The 4 months which Stanley spent with Livingstone formed a period of close friendship and happy fellowship. Together they explored the north end of Lake Tanganyika and conclusively proved that it had no connection with Lake Albert. When Stanley was stricken with fever, Livingstone nursed him back to health and strength. So the 4 months, full of happiness for Livingstone, passed away. From Ujiji they journeyed together to Yanyabi, where they had agreed that Livingstone should wait for the escort which Stanley had promised to send him from Zanzibar. Every appeal which Stanley made to him to return to England was firmly rejected. He felt that his work was not completed, and with such a man, this counted far more than life itself. Realizing the hopelessness of trying to persuade him to return to his native land, Stanley promised to provide him with a reliable escort to accompany him on his next great journey, in which he hoped to set the matter of the Nile sources at rest. And so, after months of perilous travel, hardship, and uncertainty, Stanley found the man the world had nearly given up for dead. This meeting marked not just a historic moment in the age of exploration, but a deep personal connection between two determined souls who had braved the heart of Africa in search of purpose and truth. Livingstone's legacy would live on not only in maps and journals, but in the words Stanley made famous, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Livingstone had the opportunity in the final years of his life to return to England when Stanley came to find him in the wilderness of Africa. But Livingstone refused because he felt that his work was not completed. And so Stanley ceased to try to persuade him to return to his native land. In this video on the life of David Livingstone, we're looking at his final journey, the final months of his life in Africa. So as Livingstone set out on his final journey, he was looking for the source of the Nile. And there were times when the spirit of doubt entered his mind as to the correctness of his views in regards to the Upper Nile. At Nyangwe, his instruments showed that the Lualaba was 2,000 feet above the sea, but he knew that 600 miles north of Nyangwe, the Nile, was still 2,000 feet above sea level. Obviously, therefore, if these calculations were true, the Lualaba could not be the Upper Nile. Thus he reasoned, alternating between confidence and doubt. On one occasion, when the spirit of misgivings had gripped him, he wrote in his journal, "After all, it may turn out that I have been following the Congo, and who would risk being put into a cannibal pot?" We now know that it was the Congo that he had been following, but the splendid heroism with which he clung to his idea, mistaken though he was, cannot fail to evoke admiration. The pages of his journal, which he wrote while waiting at Unyamba for his escort, were most interesting. They revealed his love of nature and showed how closely and accurate his powers of observation was. But the rigor of African travel soon told on Livingstone's enfeebled constitution. For many years he had suffered severely from hemorrhoids, but now in addition to this he was attacked with a serious dysenteric infection. His body was racked with pain and the loss of blood was constant. Pain and suffering, however, did not daunt the great pathfinder. By October he had reached the shores of Tanganyika. Skirting the southeast coast of the lake, he crossed the Kalangozi River and the mountains which lay beyond, and descending into the terribly marshy region north of Lake Bangweolo. Day by day he grew weaker. On April 19th he writes, "I am exceedingly weak, and but for the donkey could not move 100 yards. 2 days later he was unable to ride or sit up, and fell to the ground exhausted." His faithful followers then carried him until they arrived at Chitambo's village on the south side of Lake Bangweolo. A rough hut was built for him, and there his life ebbed away. On the night of April 30th, the native lads who had proved so faithful to him sat round the fire, feeling that the end was near. Loud shouts in the distance were heard, and Livingstone inquired of Susi, who was in attendance, whether it was his men who were making the noise, and received the answer that it was the villagers scaring away a buffalo from the fields. His mind was evidently wandering, for a few moments later he inquired, "Is this the Lupalo?" When he was told that he was in Chitambo's village, he sighed and said, "Oh dear, dear," then dozed off again. An hour afterward, in a feeble voice, he said to Susi, "All right, you can go now." These were the last words he was heard to speak. About 4 o'clock in the morning of May 1st, Susi heard one of the lads say, "Come to Bwana. I am afraid. I don't know if he is alive." The lad's evident fear made Susi run to arouse 4 other men, and together the 6 men went immediately to the hut. Passing inside, they looked towards the bed. Dr. Livingstone was not laying on it, but appeared to be engaged in prayer, and they instinctively drew backwards for the instant. Pointing to him, the lad said, "When I lay down, he was just as he is now, and it is because I find that he does not move that I fear he is dead." They asked the lads how long he had slept. He said he could not tell, but that he was sure it was some considerable time. The men drew nearer. A candle stuck by its own wax to the top of the box shed a light sufficient for them to see his form. Dr. Livingstone was kneeling by the side of the bed, his hands stretched forward, his head buried in his hands upon the pillow. For a minute they watched him. He did not stir. There was no sign of breathing. Then one of them, Matthew, advanced softly to him and placed his hands to his cheeks. It was sufficient. Life had been extinct some time, and the body was almost cold. Livingstone was dead. So amid the wiles of the great continent to which he had dedicated his life, the soul of that noble and heroic son of Britain passed into the presence of God. There was nothing finer in the whole sweep of history than the way in which his faithful followers acted in the great extremity to which the death of their master had brought them. They had been faithful to him in life. They were faithful to him in death. They felt that at all hazards the body must be taken to the coast in order that it might be sent to his own country. His remains were therefore roughly embalmed, then wrapped in calico, surrounded by bark, with an outside covering of sailcloth. Finally, the whole was tarred and lashed to a pole, so as to be carried by 2 bearers. Livingstone's heart was buried in the center of the little settlement where he had died. Jacob Wainwright read the burial service from the little English prayer book which belonged to his master. Then they fired their guns over the grave, and then, as Wainwright pathetically explained to Mr. Eugene Stock, these simple-hearted men sat down and cried a good deal. Their preparations completed, they started on their long and heroic march to the coast. The account of how they were struck down amid the deadly swamps of Bangweolo by terrible rheumatic infection, and how immediately they emerged from the great sponges or swamp and crossed the river Luapalo, which at this point was 4 miles in width, forms a story of surpassing interest. Nothing daunted them. At last they came to fight their way through the opposing and hostile natives. They felt that a sacred task had been committed to them, and they sought and obtained the power which enabled them to fulfill it. On the 20th of October they arrived at Kwihara, where they met Lieutenant Cameron, who had been sent by the Royal Geographical Society in charge of another Livingstone relief expedition. In February 1874, the expedition reached Bagamoyo, and the journey which had taken from 7 to 8 months came to an end. The body of Livingstone was handed over to the representatives of the British government by the simple-hearted followers of the great missionary explorer. Not a word of acknowledgment for the devotion and heroism of the natives fell from the lips of these representatives of England. Had not Mr. James Young intervened and at his own expense sent Susie, Truman, and Jacob Wainwright to England, they would not have been permitted to pay their last sad tribute of love to their dead leader. The obtuseness of the official mind is proverbial, and never was it more exemplified than in its treatment of these heroic sons of the Dark Continent. Livingstone's remains were laid to rest in the hallowed place where our best and bravest we were wont to lay. On the 18th of April, 1874, the glorious old abbey at Westminster was crowded with those who had come to pay their last sad tribute of respect to one of the noblest and purest of men. The pallbearers were Mr. H. M. Stanley, Jacob Wainwright, Sir Thomas Steele, Dr. Kirk, Mr. W. F. Webb, the Reverend Horace Waller, Mr. Oswell, and Mr. E. O. Young. 12 years before, Mr. Waller and Mr. Kirk had assisted in the burial of Mrs. Livingstone at Topanga. Among the mourners were Livingstone's surviving children, his brother and sister, sister-in-law, and father-in-law, the venerable Dr. Moffat. In the abbey, a dark marble stone marks the resting place of the great missionary explorer. On it these words are engraved, brought by faithful hands over land and sea, "Here rest David Livingstone, missionary, traveler, philanthropist. Born March 19, 1813, at Blaikie, died May 1, 1873, at Chidombo's Valley. For 30 years his life was spent in an unwavered effort to evangelize the native races, to explore the undiscovered secrets, and abolish the desolating slave trade of Central Africa, where in his last words he wrote, "All I can say in my solitude is, my heaven's rich blessings come down on every one, American, English, Turk, who will help to heal this open sore of the world." Thankful as we are that the country of his birth and love thus recognized the greatness of his life and the beauty of his character, it will be well for us to remember the truth expressed in the memorial lines which Punch offered to the dead Livingstone. He needs no epitaph to guard a name, which men shall praise while worthy work is done. He lived and died for good, be that his fame. Let marble crumble. This is Livingstone. And so our journey comes to an end. From Livingstone's humble beginnings in Scotland to his incredible travels across the vast landscapes of Africa, and finally to his final resting place in Westminster Abbey, his life is a story of courage, discovery, and determination. Through jungles, rivers, and unknown lands, Livingstone never gave up on his mission to explore and open Africa to the gospel. His legacy continues to inspire adventurers, scientists, and missionaries everywhere. But as Livingstone said, "I will go anywhere, provided it be forward." So let us go forward, ever curious, ever courageous. We want to thank you for following this journey from Blaikie to Westminster. If you have enjoyed this series, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories of God's peculiar people.